Okay, we are technically live, but we'll see how long it takes to actually show up everywhere.
Hello, everybody.
There's YouTube. Okay, great. If everyone could let us know that you could hear us and see us, that would be wonderful. That would make our lives much, much easier.
It'd also be super cool if you could tell us if our voices are about the same volume, because if they're not, we'll do some quick adjustments at this side and pretend it never happened.
Yes. Yeah, I just need to check, make sure all my stuff is good. Good. You can see us. Okay, great. Well, excellent. Wonder. Let us know with how the audio is and everything. We're very excited to be back. It's good to see you all. Nurgle has once again receded back into the realm of chaos. Once again. He'll be back someday, but for now, for now,
knowing me, he'll probably be back next week.
For now, things are back in balance. So,
our normal caveats, we're super aware there's going to be a lot of interesting potential subjects that some of you are going to want us to discuss beyond what we ourselves want to bring to the table. That being the case, when super chats come in, we will be taking them in batches. We won't be taking them all in a big one and just running through them. We'll take a chunk and then another chunk, then another chunk. But we'll try to get through them as fast as we possibly can to make sure that you all have your say. And as always, we are super glad and super delighted that you could all make it live, because it's always fun for those of you who do come in live. We'll be looking at the normal comments as they come in too, and if any of those are particularly interesting, we may bring up one of those as well.
Yeah, and this week will be particularly interesting because we're diving into, of course, most people aren't aware that just like any good fantasy universe, it feels like these days, Warhammer is technically a post-apocalyptic universe.
Yeah, it really is.
This is one.
Yeah, this is a really fun one because when we're doing our Warhammer chats, typically our Warhammer chats are diving deep into this fantasy species or this individual character or this crazy thing that happened in the Warhammer World once. And whilst this is very much the latter part of that, it's also the part where we go, hey, you know your Warhammer World? It's actually a sci-fi world and it's post-apocalyptic. And we mean peak sci-fi. It's like way up there. And that's going to be a super fun bit of this particular stream because we're going to be able to chat about some of the stuff that normally, particularly when people are thinking of their Warhammers, they're caught up in some sort of ancient reenactment of a fantasy version of Germany. That is the most common version most people know out there. And it's a really weird version of Germany seen through the lens of a lot of English-speaking writers and often with terrible pun names.
You mean herding electric counts isn't the whole, that's not the whole setting?
All the electric counts. Apparently no. And people have such a very precise view of what Warhammer is. And when it goes beyond that boundary, they start to get a bit itchy and a bit uncomfortable. There are some out there who are very much stuck in that setting because they only play, for example, fantasy roleplay. And that's often just the empire or the provinces that are close by in the realms that are beside that. For those who come from, say, Total War or from Warhammer, they are thinking about Ulthuans and their Nagaroths and their Cathays and the whole world stage. But they still don't think necessarily of the Warhammer world in totality. They just think about it in the individual game that they're playing at the moment. Where this one is very much going to be, you know your Warhammer world. Let's talk tech. Let's talk machines. Let's talk proper sci-fi stuff because that's where we're about to head into. It's gonna be super fun.
Yep. I also have like a rant about this one, which will be enjoyable. But only other things are if you haven't already, make sure that you've got it in your schedules to join us here on Wednesday. This upcoming Wednesday, it'll be same here, same channel. So we'll get that up really soon. We're going to be doing the finale of the Tarmogon series. I made a big PowerPoint presentation, which I have not touched PowerPoint in about 15 years. So that was fun.
I'm still looking forward to this.
Yeah, it's going to be really fun. We have a lot of really cool art to show off, and we're going to be talking about a lot of things and trying to take a bunch of splayed threads and make a tapestry out of it, which will be a really good time. So please do join us for that. And I think we can go ahead and get into starting super chats and then head into
our first super chats out of the way. I have a very brief intro this week, but having said that, though, I've said brief before, like 2 hours later, and then, but no, I have a brief little thing I'd like to say to get us going.
Yeah, Andy has the dwarf longbeard version of brief, not the Glad to see you better, Andy. Nurgle must be stopped. Indeed, he must.
I'm absolutely delighted to be back as well.
Buffa, make sure we detail what happened to the fishermen during this time period. You joke, but anyway, we'll get into stuff in a minute.
Yeah, we're gonna get into some of that.
Alfred, love and interest in Warhammer's grown even bigger thanks to you two. Your passion, knowledge, and intelligence are such a joy to watch. Oh, well, thank
you, Alfred. That's so appreciated.
Yeah, I love being told nice things about myself. It's great.
Yeah, me too.
Some cash for Andy to get some vitamin C supplements.
Yeah, I'm dozed up on pills and supplements right now. I have an entire, just through the door that you can see is a white glow in the background. I've got this box which is basically just all the pills that Edinburgh has to offer, laid up in lovely little
portal to the Shalia's dimension. It's glowing in the background.
Dude, okay.
You're alive!
And I'm going silent over there.
Say what?
Oh, you're back.
Oh, weird.
There we go. You went quiet to me, at least.
Well, I'm back now. Tyrant, now that Andy has his new office set up, you guys should do a Total War co-op campaign.
Yeah, we've got lots of things to discuss in the background. My office just went through its "you are an official office."
Oh, you got approved.
Oh, we got approved. We haven't received the paperwork yet. As it turned out, the architect that helped design the place, he turned up with a camera and a face on the other side, which was the council representative who went round. And they just looked at things, they looked up at stuff, and the council representative was like, "No, over there! No, look at that corner! Oh, does that toilet have a shower hidden in it? I want to see every last little corner," because they don't want people setting up Airbnb things when they're cleaning it.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
So they checked all that, and apparently it's going through the approval process just now, so I can legally be in here the second it arrives. We have a lot of things to discuss in the background.
I love that despite taking weeks, instead of sending a proper grace here, they just sent you over Far Squeaker anyway. Couldn't be bothered to show up. Entertain me, clowns. Yeah, that is what this show is all about.
Pretty much.
Laughing God, go help to you both. One part I struggle with in regards to Cataclysm is the time just before it, after the almost changed things up a bunch. Feels like no time has passed from their arrival, things blowing up. We will discuss.
We will cover that. That's a core component of understanding the Cataclysm. Yeah. I think we both have quite a few things we'd like to discuss on that front.
Yep. Shalia's blessings upon you, Andy. Look forward to this one. Always happy to see the beards full of lore. Yeah, that's what the growth stimulant is. It's just
indeed.
Lore. All right.
So we good to go?
Yep. Take us away.
Okay, so I'm going to start off, as I often like to do, by discussing not the version of the Cataclysm, the Great Catastrophe, or indeed what entails right after the coming of chaos. Not the version that we get from the most latest versions, but the one that we started off with. Because Warhammer has always been, pretty much since its very first conception, as a proper setting, not just a set of rules to move miniatures around a battlefield. It has always been the post-apocalyptic setting that we're about to discuss. It has always been a setting that at the beginning of time had a great big boom, which brought about the coming of chaos. And this great big boom was detailed in a variety of different ways, but consolidated for its most official version in the first rounds in this book here, good old Realm of Chaos book. Now, I've got a few things to say about this book, just to make sure that you get an idea of what this book represents, because this may be for you an entirely alien what the hell is this book. Right at the beginning of Warhammer's, let's say, inception as a full setting, back in the 3rd edition of Warhammer and the 1st edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, the core concepts of what would become the world's timeline, the gods that we understand today, the old ones, the Slan, the creation of the Chaos Gates that would eventually effectively destroy the world. All of that was laid out and detailed cleanly inside the Realms of Chaos books. There's 2 of them in particular, but this book, don't think this is old stuff that no longer applies. Games Workshop still sell this book. If you go to Warhammer World, like I did, you can buy this. This is my new Warhammer World copy, not my 1st edition copy, which is a tattered mess that looks like it has been through every plague that Nurgle could offer. And
my 8th edition book is a little...
yeah, that's my Realm of Chaos book. And in that book, pretty much everything that would become the core of the setting that you understand today, for those of you who know the Cataclysm, is laid out in black and white. It's got a single page dedicated to it, but it is very old in terms of how it's presented. I'll bring it up. The good old spread of chaos. You can actually see the Warhammer World as it's been depicted there. And if I bring it right up to the camera, I'm not sure how well this will be seen.
Yeah, there you go. Yep, perfect.
The continents.
Yep,
the continents we know and love. So there's the good old Warhammer World. And they explain there in some detail about there's a couple of lore changes that will happen later. I'll detail them very briefly just now before we go on to the core of what we're about to discuss. Number one, there was no old ones. It was just the old Slan. They were called the Old Slan. And the Old Slan devolved into the Slan that we know today in the initial version of it.
Yeah, the buff ones.
Another lore change that was to come, the orcs and the goblins, they worshipped chaos back in those early days. So back in the very first ones, if you look at the original descriptions of the Bastion Stair, for example, and we mentioned the Bastion Stair in our Khorne breakdown for the realms of good old... Oh, well, we covered that in some extent, actually, over on our Khorne stream. Was that our last one?
Yeah. Yep, 2 weeks ago. Yep.
Wow, holy moly. So yes, we covered that in our Khorne stream. Go check that over on Sotek's channels. So do go take a check on that one, because the Bastion Stair also first mentioned inside this book. And here we get ourselves a cataclysmic event. An event that changes the Warhammer world completely. There is the point where beforehand we had the old Slan that had arrived on silver ships and had populated the world. And they had done a variety of things that we're about to discuss in detail. Then a great cataclysm occurs, as detailed here. The coming of chaos occurs. And even in this very first version of it, they fill it with vague potential, in that they don't say that how it occurred, why it occurred, exactly what ramifications there were beyond the world flooded with magic that comes from an extra dimensional space and floods the Warhammer world. Chaos comes, invades, it's really, really bad, and that's it. They don't describe in this early version how chaos was brought to heel, how it stopped, why the first war came to an end, or how it came to an end. It merely happened. And then in this version, the next war that they're worried about is the one that happens 200 years before the end of the world blowing up. And that's the Great War against Chaos, when chaos sweeps down into Kislev and is stopped by Magnus the Pious. So we get our first version of it here, and very little changes as we move through the editions from this point. There is one major lore change. The old Slan become the old ones. And the old Slan are probably no longer the same thing as the old ones, because the old ones get a far deeper, weirder description in comparison to what the old Slan were before.
Really weird.
Yeah, really, really weird. So that changes significantly. And that's it. That's it. All the rest of it is copy, pasted, and dropped into the 4th edition of Warhammer, then the 5th, then the 6th, then the 7th, then the 8th, and all the way up to the Old World. And they don't change the core details pretty much at all, but they do add. And when I say they add a hell of a lot. And with each edition of the game, they add an extra permutation as to what happened during the course of this event. In some cases, they detail how the war came to an end. The 4th edition of Warhammer, for example, makes it clear that it was the elves what did it. Then we move on to the 5th edition, 6th edition, then eventually hit the Old World, where they say, yeah, the elves did it, but so did everyone else too. The war was all over the world. We will be discussing this as we go, because the final version that we get in the Old World is pretty much the same one that we get in 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th, all the way through. Each one takes slightly different angles, but I think that's something that for this topic somewhat uniquely, we can say all of them kind of still stand. And the reason for that is that it's a time of myth. It is a time of legend. It is a time where nothing is certain, and every time they write about it, every single time a new writer sits down, they go to all the previous sources, they pull whatever bit they like, and then they just write a slightly different copy-pasted version with, I don't know, an edit or two added for whatever faction they're writing about today. So you tend to find that of all of the various Games Workshop changes that have occurred to the Warhammer world, the Great Catastrophe, this great cataclysm that kicks it all off at the beginning of time, is one of the few things where we can say, I don't really care which edition you go to. Go take a look, have a wee read. You'll find that most of the details are not contradicted by a later book, because every later book says something along the lines of, and yea, in times of past, when things were weird, stuff happened, no one knows why. These things happened, and probably these too. It was terrible. But they don't tend to contradict each other. Even when you look at, say, for example, an individual species, let's say the lizardmen, if you go through the first version of the lizardmen through to the latest one in 8th edition, and then as we move through into the old world, obviously, the tiny details might be projected in a slightly different way, but ultimately, it's one giant cataclysm, and most of the tales can probably stand.
Yeah, there's only... So, funny enough, there's only one example. So I actually went and read through all the Cataclysm material in prep for today's stream from from 5th edition forwards. And one of the things that made me laugh is there was one author who made a huge change in 8th edition, and everyone else just ignored him.
Which one? Okay. Do we want to do that first, or will we do that after?
No, I'll do it first just because it's funny and it's very brief. Cool. So in the big red book for 8th edition, it was the first time in like the big book where they made a really detailed timeline of the whole world and talked about everybody. But for some reason, the author in there, he must have looked at the Cataclysm and he decided that the old ones only showed up 300 years before, and that's it. So they showed up in 5,900 years before, whereas every other book's like, no, they showed up 15,000 years ago. And the old world fixes it back, but it just made me laugh because he was just like, we don't need this. And it's like 300 years? That's really fast.
It really is. In fact, I think that's probably the best place for us to begin properly, which is in silvered ships they came.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean, quoting there, the Book of Days by Finrier of Safri. And by that, I mean the arrival of the old ones and what the old world... What the old world? It's not called the old world. What the Warhammer world was before the old ones arrived. So, do you want to jump off in that one?
Yeah. So, and I will note,
I do believe the good old ones arriving.
Yeah. So, I will note that for the sake of the stream, we're going to be covering a lot of things that, interestingly, the old world, despite the fact it really shouldn't, focuses a lot on. So, if you go back and watch the 3-parter me and Andy did on it, we talk a lot about the changes and, frankly, not huge changes they simultaneously did. Because like Andy said, when it comes to dealing with like the prehistory of the world, GW's actually done a pretty decent job of, instead of there being like constant retcons, which they do with later parts of the timeline, instead it's almost more like you just get more character perspectives that just kind of add more details on, oh, what was going on in this part of the world or what was going on over here. So like the old world basically told us a lot of information we already knew. It just added some more details for like the dwarfs and Grand Cathay. Like they got a lot more detail in the old world, which was neat. But that is to say, in pretty much all versions of the story, we have the arrival of the old ones, which we have this planet that is very, for the most part, very cold, covered in lots of ice with an equatorial band that's got some really crazy primeval jungles with big old megafauna. And we've got things like sky titans and dragons and shaggoths and all sorts of other crazy things, leviathans and behemoths just roaming around the world. We've got little hints and pieces that there were some ancient civilizations at this time, but we don't get a lot of info about them. So if you want your haha fisherman thing, this very likely has some references to them there.
In fact, I'll go slightly further on that. Most of the species that we know for the Warhammer world are, broadly speaking, elevated species. So there's lots of primordial versions of species that we know later in the Warhammer world. And at various points in various books, they will drop a quick sentence saying, oh, these were here back then. And then a later book just won't mention them, but it doesn't contradict what necessarily came before. So if you take, for example, what will later be the formation of the Beastmen, the Beastmen come from a primordial group of humans that were not the elevated humans, presumably, that have been put in place by the old ones later. So there is a host of interesting side stories that we can plumb into here. But not only do we have our megafauna, but we probably have a variety of relatively primitive species that are living on this world already.
There's the whole thing about like the Saurus were unleashed to wipe out undesirables, which there were undesirables hanging around.
Totally. And we also have the possibility through the course of not necessarily retcons, but most certainly the hints during rewrites, particularly with the Lizardmen, that the other species that become the core species of the Warhammer world may have been wholly created. There is always that hint, but if you go to any of the older sources, that definitely isn't the case. And even the most recent one, it's nothing more than a hint. It does suggest that they are uplifted from the existing species rather than necessarily created from clear whole cloth. But there is always that slight hint that some of the species were literally just spawned from nothing, particularly if you look at, say, the Lizardmen and how they were potentially created. There's always that hint running through the text that they were just made. Take, for example, the Slann. The Slann who were probably ported in off-world. That's the concept, but probably as a species.
Yeah, that's one of the things that gets really interesting is that Games Workshop has always had kind of a relationship when it comes to strict timelines. They don't like it, to put it bluntly. I mean, there's a good reason that when they went into Age of Sigmar and they were doing things that they preferred, they completely got rid of timelines as a concept. Where, like, you still have it, but there's no years. That way they can just kind of make it very loose. And fantasy, they've always tried to pin down a timeline, and it gets messy because a lot of the times it disagrees with itself, which led to circumstances where they introduced the old ones. And if you go back to 6th edition, it very bluntly says that the first generation Slann were on the spaceships with the old ones and came down and started doing stuff. And then 7th edition went, no. They were created after the old ones got here. Which is interesting and not necessary. And once again, it's just different version. It's not a huge change, but it's an interesting change.
I agree completely. Particularly when you look at, I think the Slann are a very good example of this because Croak, for example, or Croak, if you prefer to make it sound less like a frog, but Croak, good old Croak, who is obviously dead also because he's croaked it. Good old Croak, Lord Croak, the first Slann of the Warhammer world. He is expressly, in some versions of the background, spawned on the world. But in others, he kind of wasn't. So he could be super ancient or not. We are less concerned with the minor details here because they don't necessarily matter. Because we do know that most of the species of the Warhammer world were genetically modified to one degree or another by the old ones. They are the great sorcerer scientists who are tinkering with shit. But we'll get to why they're doing that in a moment. It's also worth saying that of all the species of the Warhammer world that are likely to have come from elsewhere, or to have just been literally created, it seems likely the elves could be a part of that. They are not necessarily uplifted, depending on which version of the background you go with. They're often sort of given that slight, we were ported in, but were they? Were they not? The elves love to think that they're special. Anyway, let's get to the core of who the hell are these guys? What's going on with the old ones? Really, what's up here? So we have got ourselves a cold, frigid planet, which is covered in great sheets of ice and this band of life. And even though the ice that fills most of the world may be inhospitable to most, there is great behemoth-like creatures that are living up in those icy sheets as well. This is a world that is already redolent with life. It is filled, absolutely chock-a-block filled with creatures. And the rulers of all of this, if we go with the most recent lore, is the dragons. They are the top of the pyramid creatures. The dragons rule the world. And then the old ones come. So who are these guys? Well, they are, let's lay it out in very simple, blunt terms, rather than dropping into the poetry that Games Workshop often likes to use, because they will start going with, oh, they are mystic, weird, bullshit. They are a magical stroke physical. So they are both magical and not magical, wrapped up together. Sorcerer scientists who have a massive, massive empire that spreads not just physically, but also through time. This is dropped in multiple places. Okay, and this is something that's particularly important for the old world, where you realize that the old ones, and when we look at what happens during the cataclysm, they never really vanish because they are also an empire through time, not just an empire through space. They are deeply, deeply beyond the very physical world that they arrive in. But they do arrive physically in silver ships that are seen by the dragons that are down there. There are tales throughout the Warhammer world of the Old Ones' first arrival, and in silver ships they came. Once they get there, the changes begin. And when I say changes, everything about this world is about to go into enormous upheaval. So we can imagine a world that's quite distant from the sun of the Warhammer World sun, so quite distant away, covered in ice, arrival of the Old Ones. They get to work building enormous machines. They get to work building enormous, not just machines, but sorcery machines, because the Warhammer world is not only filled with life, it is filled with magic, a magic that they intend to tap. When they first arrive, as it said in multiple places, something about this world made them go, yep, this is the one.
Yep.
This is the one. This one matters, is incredibly important. So they get to work. And they get to work doing a couple of key things. Number one, they build machines to create a geomantic web. This is number one. The geomantic web is a channeling of all the natural magic that sits in the world. Don't think of your Azirs and your Shamans and your various other winds of magic out there. This is the natural magic of the world being channeled. If we go with the old world version, those fragmented winds will not arrive until way after the cataclysm. But there are many hints that those winds were already in existence to a degree beforehand. So there are multiple conflicting stories here as to exactly when the winds themselves turn up. But what we know for certain is that we have a big, huge network of sites that get built on the world. And these sites become the center of Old One activity on the Warhammer world. And they build their very first, not just temple cities, as they often get referred to, particularly by the Lizardmen. They build their first big, let's say, spawning pools, because that's how the Lizardmen like to refer to these things. Great big spawnings of creatures that they intend to use to control this world. The Lizardmen are created pretty much as we know them from the army lists. And they rumble out from these cities, all of which are on exceedingly important places for the geomantic web, and start pacifying the world according to the needs of the Old Ones. They don't know why they're doing it. They just do it. With the Slan, that's the big froggy toads, if you haven't seen those already, the Slan being responsible for much of the masterminding of this, as their great plan is slowly but surely put into place.
Yeah, some things I want to add that's really interesting that gives us a little more insight into the alienness of the Old Ones, because I think it's really important to key down on just how fucking weird these guys are. One of the things is that Games Workshop kind of noticed very quickly that they would kind of have a bit of a, oh, well, we'd have to actually describe them if they were actually out doing things, everyone could see them very casually. So they ran with the idea that, oh, well, only the first generation Slan actually dealt with them. And that what most of the sacred plaques are is that the first generation Slan would meet with the Old Ones and would come back from these meetings and would crystallize these plaques out of pure thought that would be like, okay, this is what the boss told us to do. Which in and of itself is a fascinating concept of that for the first generation Slan to communicate what the Old Ones want, they have to take something that is, you know, almost etheric or non-physical and bind it into a physical form so that it can then be disseminated to the rest of the Lizardmen. Which alone speaks to some kind of wild insanity when it goes to the Old Ones part. And the other thing about the Old Ones, when you delve into like a lot of the Lizardmen army books, there have been some of the authors have kind of taken little cracks at giving some hints on what the Old Ones themselves were like. And the thing that you learn really quick is that they are not a consistent species. It's not like, oh, they all look like Slan, or they all look like humans, or they all look like whatever. Each one of them is so bizarrely unique that it almost comes across that if they even had physical forms, which is hard, like it seems like they did, but they also didn't simultaneously. If they did, it almost seems very much like they chose what they looked like, to the extent that the Lizardmen would associate certain kinds of things with each of the Old Ones that the Old One really, really liked and seemed to almost emulate. Like the Old One would almost take on a form that was in an echo of the things they particularly enjoyed, where like Hanchi is described as this god of darkness and panthers and a predatorial spirit that lurks in the shadows. whereas you've got, which that sounds like, okay, so I can kind of imagine what that kind of looks like. But then you look at Tepok the Inscrutable, whose whole thing is that he's the big magical one, but he was so bizarre and unknowable and was like a shimmering cloud of dust that maybe has association with like some quaddles and weird creatures. But then you have like one of the war gods, Tlonxla, he's described very bluntly as, oh yeah, he was flying around in a chariot and he wielded a spear, like he was wielding a weapon that has been passed down to Lizardmen, which makes him sound very physical and very grounded. So you have these, like, they're fucking bizarre creatures.
Yeah, they're bizarre. And I think that's the best way to just consider them. Don't think of them as the original pitch for them, which was the old Slann, a bunch of frog folk who devolved into the
these
Slann
are not the 40k old ones who very much are still old Slann.
Yeah, we're in a very different place. These old ones are very weird, bizarre entities. Now, that doesn't mean that Games Workshop might not return them to what they once were, but at least in the current lore and how it currently stands, they definitely are not that. But they do have tools. Not only tools of extraordinary power, much of which have been passed down to the Lizardmen as machines of the old ones or workings of the old ones. But this is in no way reflective of what they actually had. So let's spin a quick idea of what they're about to do, because they're not just now beginning to conquer the world. They're building machines, and these machines are huge. Two of the biggest machines that we're aware of that they create are what are now called the Chaos Gates, but the great gates that sit at the poles at the north and the south pole of the world. And these are great gates that they bring things, ships, other old ones, species, technology from other parts of their empire through. And they can go from other parts of the galaxy directly through to the Warhammer world using these great gates. Now, what are these gates? Well, we have very little in the way of direct...
Stargate!
They are basically giant stargates. If you want the description, and these are, in terms of lore, they were built way before Stargate was even a thing, but they are the size of a mountain, at least. They are repeatedly described as floating significantly up above the poles. They're not sitting literally on the pole. People can walk up to it. These are for taking spaceships through. And they are truly enormous in size. Very, very large. And they are made of, amongst other things, what is commonly referred to in the Warhammer world as star metal. Because when these things eventually blow up, star metal falls from the sky in 1,000 places, streaking through, and a whole lot worse. And these great gates connect directly through to a completely different dimension, another plane of existence. It's a plane of existence that the elves, and often Warhammer in general, because they run out of words, refer to as the Aether. If you read any of the Chaos books, they'll refer to it typically as the Realm of Chaos. It is the other plane on the other side from whence magic comes. Now, the very first description of the Realm of Chaos to any decent degree came again in the original Realm of Chaos books, strangely enough. And over there, they've got some descriptions which have been, again, copy-pasted throughout the books from the 80s, all the way up to the very last Warhammer book.
When you strike gold, you strike gold, right?
Yeah, absolutely. This other realm, this other place where all living souls have a reflection. Literally everything alive has got some form of reflection over on the other side. And it's those reflections that cause ripples and swirls and twists in the Aether. And these ripples, these swirls, and these twists can sometimes spawn their own life. And this is where the background begins to diverge massively, streaming off in different directions, according to the book you write. And I mean, I write, because I've written a couple. Yeah. According to, the book you read. In that at this point, some will say it was always like this, and there were otherworldly things out there that as the old ones gathered in the Warhammer world, they felt the machines that were being built. They felt the great network of the geomantic web. And then as this great network of magic was used, and all the pinpricks of light that were creating the geomantic web were put into place, and the old ones moved the world towards the sun to warm it, that caused all manner of ripples over in the Aether. Life went into shock because the world started to change significantly. And some didn't like it for, I think, relatively obvious. The world is getting hot and weird and but it didn't damage the folk that were there. Don't think of this as the great cataclysm that it should be, because the old ones protected the world as they brought it in. They protected, and the Slann started to reshape the world. The great, massive, almost Pangea-like continent that was almost certainly there to begin with begins to split. And interestingly, for those of you who want proper conspiracy theories, begins to split into a model of real-world Earth.
Yeah,
just take a moment to think of that.
Yeah, the old ones wanted the planet in a very particular shape.
Wanted the planet to look like real world Earth. Now, that's just a really fun little thing to say, because back in its original creation, 40k and Warhammer aren't just linked. They are one and the same setting. They're not separate. The book, if we pull up this one, this isn't a Warhammer or a 40k book. It's for both. Literally for both. Because it's exactly the same setting. Now, admittedly, exactly where the Warhammer world may be, it might not even be in the same galaxy. It could be elsewhere. It could be in a different time, because that's the whole point of the old ones. They span across time itself. It's not so intrinsically linked that they're in the same place, but they're definitely linked through the aether. Meaning that they have replicated Terra. I'd just like to drop that one here, because it's quite because that's what they've done. This isn't an important fact, but it is worth noting that they have replicated Terra to a degree. And that's kind of
ones are going, well, okay, we clearly fucked up the first one, so let's make it.
Okay, because remember, the 40k setting is not a fantasy science fiction-y weird thing that doesn't exist anywhere. It's our future. Okay, so if you take this to be true, then the Warhammer world has been created to template on our planet, using a template that the old ones created. That is fascinating, and it is certainly irrelevant to the greater scheme of what we're about to discuss.
Yeah.
But let's shelf that one at the side, because it's proper crazy.
I do want to jump in for a moment to talk about something Andy said that I found really interesting reading through all the different editions, which is that one of the things the authors really ping-ponged on a lot, Games Workshop did, was what was the state of the ether at this like early time when the old ones are like building up stuff and they're using it a lot. Because in some various books, and when I say different editions, I'm not just talking about the big books. I'm talking about, if you really want to delve into these, you want to check out like the Lizardman book, the Demons of Chaos book, the Warriors of Chaos book, the High Elves book, because they really delve into this. Some books have it where the ether was like pretty much empty, and then as the old ones made more and more life, it caused more and more reflections, and this caused like the birth and creation of things over there that started to gain sentience and became resentful and yada yada. But then some books, like Andy said, had it where no, there was always something lurking over there. This universe had its own forms of life. It had its own things that started to get irritated by this weird intrusion coming in from this other dimension, and started like a body defending itself, started attacking it. Which the old world, the newest book, is interesting in that it literally took both ideas and just smashed them together instead of just flip-flopping. Where the old world really literally comes around and says, oh yeah, no, there were always things there lurking, but they were at first resentful, but then they got a look at the dimension the old ones were coming from, and they desired it for themselves. They grew envious of it, and they wanted it. Which was I really enjoyed that they split the difference there instead of just going back to the flip-flop, because it makes for a better story. And there's something we're going to delve into. I've seen some super chats about it already that we'll get into in a moment, but we're going to get into some of the really big questions of the Cataclysm, which has to do with gods and what's going on in the ether. And honestly, the fact that they split the difference for the old world makes confronting that question a lot more fun than it used to be.
And potentially a bit easier as well. Yeah. So we've got ourselves entities that are living out there. Now, there are different ways we can interpret that, as Sotek has made pretty clear there, but largely because Games Workshop themselves have interpreted it in slightly different ways in different books. But most of them at least hint at the idea that the Great Chaos Gates themselves are the way through which many of these entities are looking into the material realm. And they are seeing things that they couldn't do previously. Now, let's again take a small pause to have a quick idea of what's happening to the Warhammer world during this great golden era. this great golden era, because well, it's not really a golden era. Let's call it the silver era after all.
Yeah, which granted, this takes about 10,000 years.
Okay, so we start at 15,000, approximately 17,000 years ago, approximately.
Yeah.
And this goes for thousands of years. Eventually, the Warhammer world is brought closer to the sun, and it gets itself a new orbit in a completely different place, and it becomes a much warmer world. And slowly but surely, the spells that the Great Slann are using, and spells is a really Warhammer way of describing what they're doing, but it would be better to say the technology that they're using.
Yeah, engineering.
It is engineering. And they are using the magic from this other realm, the geomantic web in particular, because this planet is somehow unique with it, or all the Old One planets have this for all we know. They use the geomantic web to keep all of the continents safe, to separate them, to build the world in the way that they want it to be.
Also, thanks to Andy's writings, we know that they didn't also just change where the Warhammer world was, they changed where the entire solar system was.
Yes. And then the entire solar system is shifted into something else as well. The engines that they use, the world engines that they use to put everything in place, exist on every planet in the Warhammer solar system, of which there's 10 planets at least at the current count. So literally everything is changed and put into a position of near perfection. And throughout the course of this, the Warhammer world is at war. Do not think of this as a time of peace. The Lizardmen, through their various new cities, spread outwards across the world and slaughter everything in their path, or take prisoner of anything that they need so that the Old Ones can then change them into whatever it is that is required for the next steps of their plan.
That doesn't sound horrific at all. There's a really cool, there's a really cool quote, I think, from the 7th edition Lizardman book, which says that the Old Ones from their starships could see what looked like great serpents moving across the surface of the planet, which was these Saurian legions of, I mean, think about that. An army so big, you could see it from orbit looking like a snake. And it says each individual scale being hundreds of Saurus warriors massacring their way across the planet. And you're like, oh my God.
Yeah. And this goes on for millennia. This is not a short period. Now, before the cataclysm comes, something else occurs. And let's just, again, quickly describe what we have as a world. We have a world where the Old Ones have come and they have taken pretty much absolute control. The vast majority of the entities and creatures that lived in that world have either been killed, slaughtered, or fled and hidden away, possibly inside mountains, in caves, places that the Old Ones literally don't care about, which are probably out with the reach of the average Lizardmen because they're in the colder climes, because the Lizardmen don't like the cold. They tend to live in the steamy hot jungles. With the Lizardmen, their primary servants tend not to hang around in, an Antarctic party house. Not their thing. But do remember, there will be Lizardmen up in space. This is a proper, I do mean proper, sci-fi setting at the moment, where there are gates across this planet connecting all of the major cities of the Lizardmen, all of the important points of the geomantic web together. You can go from one place to another place almost instantly. All the Slann can communicate instantly with each other using the geomantic web at any particular point. Yeah, and that includes right up to the ones that are sitting up in the Chaos Gates or possibly out on the moon Mansleib, because at the moment there's only a single moon. Mansleib, as it's later called, but we have one moon, which we also know from a couple of sources almost certainly has its own species. It does have its own species, and was also a part of the Old One's plan. So they're up there too. The whole place has been taken over and turned into a sci-fi, well, if you're on the Lizardman side, a sci-fi utopia. If you're not on the Lizardman side, a hellhole, where you're probably living in terror.
Yeah, if you're a dragon ogre or a Famir, times are not great.
And that is when we get our first whispering from the Chaos Gods. Now, you could argue from the etheric entities, but I'm going to later on suggest that it's a little bit more complicated than that. So let's keep their very clear distinctions and say the Chaos Gods. The Chaos Gods are not the 4 gods that we all know and love. They are much more than this at this point. At this point, those are 4 of the great powers. To be later, they are here, but there are many, many other entities slithering around on the aether on the other side of these gates looking at all these connecting network of paths spreading across this physical space, seeing it, being jealous, and as they grow more and more arguably coherent, and they begin whispering to people. And in pretty much every source where it's mentioned, the gods, these early gods, most of them pretend to be entirely benevolent. And I do find it interesting because they refer to it as a pretense, while simultaneously in places, there's no pretense. So the first argument where I'm going to deviate potentially from the written lore here is that most of the gods are formed in this era, whether they're chaos gods or not. This seems to be the point where they're forming. And everything that is being attracted to this Warhammer world is beginning to fall into place. And if you've checked our earlier streams, I'll also add something that we've discussed more than one occasion. This is the Old One's plan.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that especially when you're dealing with recent writings that approved by Games Workshop from coming out from Cubicle 7, when they released the Lustria book, one of the big bombshells they dropped in the Lustria book was that the Famir were communicating with something beyond, something from the ether way before the Cataclysm. That they had built their own totems to their gods and stuff that they were praying to, entities and concepts they were praying to, and something started whispering back to them.
Yeah,
which
exactly the same for the Dragon Ogres as well. Go check our Dragon Ogre stream because we go into depth with the Dragon Ogres and exactly what they represent because it's pretty fucking important to this. For example, the Dragon Ogres, long before the Cataclysm, are making deals with the Chaos Gods because they are getting wiped out by the Lizardmen. And they make a deal that stands right the way through to the end of the Warhammer world. Because for all they're on the Chaos side, the Dragon Ogres, in their extraordinary power, are far more than that alone.
Yeah, and the thing that's really fascinating about it is a lot of people, and once again, this is because depending on which edition you read, you are given a very bluntly different answer. Something, I know Andy's not a huge fan of this, but this is like what I believed for the longest time because of, I want to say it was 7th edition, was that if you picked up certain books, they would literally describe the Chaos Gods as they're just manifestations of emotion. That's literally all they are. Like Khorne is just the manifestation of hatred, Tzeentch is the manifestation of hope, Nurgle's the manifestation of despair, and Slaanesh is the manifestation of excess. That's all they are. Period. End of story. But the second you start reading all of the other stuff and you start going beyond and you start looking at Warhammer Fantasy on its own, instead of, to put it very bluntly, the 40k versions of the gods, which have not changed as much, you start looking and going, well, that doesn't make sense. Because in fantasy, that would not explain all the other gods, and it wouldn't explain, which we'll get into in a minute, things like the War in Heaven and all these other concepts, which imply that, no, there is a life in the ether. There are entities already there, already doing their own thing, which as the editions got later, Games Workshop leaned much more into that thing because fantasy got its own unique version of the Realm of Chaos, where no, there are sentient living things out there. Now, like I think Andy and I will talk about a little bit, some of them end up being changed by their relationship with the material world significantly, but that's still, but they are not simply, like if you read like Liber Chaotica, which once again looks at a unified chaos from 40k and fantasy, you have characters in there that go, oh, well, they're just vortices of emotions and nothing more.
And that's because Marianne, when he was writing that book, very much drew upon the older lore when he's putting it together, and it works really well. It gives it,
and it works very
horrific, beyond the understanding of anything mortal feeling that works really well for those books, and is almost certainly, to as much as any of the writers are concerned, correct. Great vortices of emotion and all the various demons that sit on the edge of that may not be directly related to the core of that emotion that sits spitefully hatred sitting in the middle of Khorne, for example, or whatever it might be. But we have great chaos gods beginning to form over in the aether, or always in the aether, and a whole host of other gods as well. They are not more, they are not less powerful in a variety of different ways. All we know for certain is that some of these gods are bad, as we would describe it, chaos gods, and they start making deals with a variety of species in the Warhammer world without the knowledge, presumably, of the old ones. But that's just simply not true, because as we find out, the old ones planned the whole freaking thing in the first place. But we also know another thing for certain that happens back at this point. The elves, the children of the old ones in many respects, beyond the Lizardmen themselves, okay, who are given their own little special island of Ulthuan, which was raised up from the very depths and left there, they become pretty much entities that are hand in hand taught by gods. Not taught by the old ones, taught by gods. So there are more gods than just simply the chaos gods out there whispering away and doing other things. There are other gods, or possibly the same gods, depending upon how you want to look at it. Bluntly, there are gods talking to mortals. That's all we really need to do. Not only are they talking to them, though, they are now beginning to manifest. They are literally messing around with the elves and living with them.
Yeah, one of the things I find really interesting that I think a lot of people don't think about is that a lot of people only ever think of chaos, or not chaos, but the gods and the ether from a real world perspective. So they go, oh, look how like powerful the gods are. They can like change the world. They can cause miracles. They can make all these crazy powerful things. Like they're so amazing and stuff. Whereas what I think a lot of people don't think about, which is really core to the Cataclysm story, is that as much as mortals value the ether as an energy source, as a place to pull the power by which to change the physical world into how they desire it, there is something that the gods are desperately wanting from the physical world and the people that live within it to pull into the ether that allows them to almost do something similar. Where I've always found that such a fascinating thing of that the gods are so desperate for the attention of mortal beings.
It's interesting because there's lots of different ways that we can imagine these entities, because they are written in lots of different ways. But the most consistent way that we have is that the mortals, in particular, let's be blunt, it's the elves. The elves are deeply etheric creatures who deeply influence the aether in the same way that the Elder do in 40k. They're basically the same species. They are deeply etheric, and they are the ones that start massively influencing the aether on the other side as their emotional spirals, because they're deeply emotional creatures, spin and churn and mess around over on the ether side. And that's causing the awakening of new entities, new emotional spirals. And those are entities that are directly linked to the elves. And they come back and they say hi. And who created whom? According to the elves, they were created both hand in hand. According to the gods, it's the same. It's a complicated setup. We don't have direct answers from the official literature. But what we do have is that the elven gods are with the elves right now. Right now, before the Cataclysm, they are there, living with them in peace, teaching them how to do things. And this is according to the old ones' plans, because they're watching on going, yep, this is what we want. This is exactly what we want. The whole thing is going according to plan. They don't stop this. They don't interrupt this. There is no great story amongst the lizardmen saying, oh, and the old ones went to live amongst the elves because they were special. No, the old ones only spoke to the Slann. There is a definite disparate.
Well, I want to throw three spanners into this. Not just
more than three.
But there are three things I want to add to this that I find interesting that I don't think disagree with that, are just interesting things to think about. One of the things that's super interesting about the elves is that a lot of the sources that talk about the elves, especially when you're reading the Lizardman stories and stuff, or some of the big red books, is it talks about how the old ones, it's like, okay, they created the Lizardmen as kind of the custodians of the planet, the guys that are there to like manage everything and take care of all the small tasks that they don't want to deal with so they can focus on the big plan. And then they create the elves. And what's fascinating is you have a lot of stories that say, okay, they create the elves, and then they look at the elves and go, not quite what we wanted. Not bad, but not quite what we wanted. They're too magical. They're too...
Are they?
Well, so let me finish, because I think it goes somewhere interesting. That they put the elves off to the side, and then they make the dwarves and go, okay, and they do almost the opposite. They make a race that's very not magical and go, okay, these guys have problems too. Let's put them off to the side. And then they start making humanity and things start to go tits up. One of the things that's really interesting about that is a potential option. I don't think
I'm going to disagree on that one. Things don't go tits up. It happens in a 1.
So, okay, hold on. So let me get to the end of this little story. So, we have three interesting things, though once again, messy. I'm going to reiterate messy. So the Lizardman books tell a really interesting amount of details about the 5 generations of Slann. That each generation was made for a purpose, where like the first generation helped move the planet, the second generation helped break up the continents, and then the third generation helped with construction of all the temple cities and the geometric web. And then the fourth generation's weird, because the fourth generation mentions that the fourth generation were made to repair problems with the polar gates. That the old ones noticed something was wrong with them, and that the fourth generation Slann show up and they're put in charge of managing repairs. And then the fifth generation of Slann are created only a handful of centuries before the Cataclysm, and they're also made to help with issues with the polar gates. And it's noted that they're made in haste, which is weird and really interesting. Another thing that's super interesting is Lord Croak, one of his big feats that he's credited with is that he taught the earliest ancestors of the elves how to use magic. That Lord Croak sat down with them, Big Daddy Croak somewhere, not necessarily in Ulthuan, because it doesn't state that, but somewhere, and he taught their earliest ancestors how to use magic. One of the things that I find really interesting as a potential story, I don't think it's necessarily the truth, but a potential story that's interesting, is if you run with the idea of like how in the old world disagrees with itself in a way that I like, where it very heavily implies the old ones knew exactly what was going to happen, but then it has a direct quote saying that the old ones did not know what was going to happen and they were surprised, which I like.
Yeah, we discussed that one out.
Yeah. And one of the things that I like is a potential idea, though it's not the truth by any means, is the idea that the elves are created, the old ones overall like them, but say not quite, and they put them on Ulthuan to allow them to keep developing, and they don't pay enough attention to them. Of that, some of the old ones, which once again, the old ones are not a monolith. We have stories about like how Rig with the Amazons kind of was almost a rogue old one, which opens up a whole can of worms of that the old ones were not agreeing with each other. And then there's the whole thing of why was there one old one creating halflings and another one creating ogres, and why were they so different yet similar, and all sorts of other shit. But the thing that I find really interesting as a potential story of the idea of the elves being left alone in Ulthuan, the elves who uniquely, like kind of Andy said, among all the races, like we have lizardmen, dwarves, humans, halflings, ogres, elves. The elves are the only race that create gods in this era. Yeah, they're the only ones that do it. And it almost comes off like not only were they the only ones capable of it, but that nobody was either no one realized they could do it, and so they weren't watching them, or like Andy said, maybe they were supposed to do it.
Yeah. So we bluntly and very bluntly know that the old ones want the world to blow up. We know this. The old world makes it clear. Games Workshop want to support Age of Sigmar, and they want the Age of Sigmar setting to be part of the Great Old One myth. The whole point of the Warhammer world is Age of Sigmar. That is what they're building towards. That being the case, they require the gods. This world, this place is special potentially because of this. So my general suggestion, without any great depth behind it, is that when we look at what happens, your general position should always be, this is what the old ones planned, because they did. Every time we get a new plaque that pops out from nowhere, it generally says, oh, you know, all those things you thought weren't planned. Actually, this is about to occur, and it's a terrible thing. The Great Catastrophe, it's expected, or whatever it might be. Everything that occurs, the old ones have planned, and that includes the lizardmen being dropped into a terrible place. Literal ignorance for the Slann. The Slann are nothing more than pieces on a board that the old ones are playing with. Now, as we discussed in our previous stream when we're going through the old world and exactly what it suggested in terms of how it changed everything, we were quite clear that it seemed that the old ones may have had multiple potential outcomes. Now, one way of imagining that would be having different old ones. Each of one had an opinion, and they all wanted a different end, and one won out. That'd be one way of imagining it. But I think that is literally how to imagine it, because the old ones are not creatures with simple intelligence that are trapped in the here and the now. They are, in many respects, beyond the gods themselves. They are different. They're literally different. So to say that it didn't work according to their plan or it didn't land where they wanted is in many respects to say the one version of the Warhammer world is one potential out of all the chaos that goes. They set the whole thing off. They knew where it was going. They knew the endpoint they wanted. And that includes the gods. The Chaos Gods are an essential component of the Old World's plan, as are the elves, as are the dwarves, as are the lizardmen, as are the Khaines, the Nipponese, the kingdoms of Bucharest. Everything else is part of their plan. And how it all blows up at the end is their plan. So for most of the sources, as we head closer and closer towards the Cataclysm, will say something like this. And the old ones didn't realize that the Chaos Gods were whispering to various people across the Warhammer world. Or the old ones didn't understand why the Chaos Gates were beginning to collapse, so they put other things in place. It's all one giant ruse.
Yeah, I think for me, I think one thing that's critical to the old ones being the old ones is I don't want there to ever, this is going to sound weird, but stick with me. I don't want it to be something I can understand of. I want to look at this and go, that literally makes no fucking sense. I
don't like quite that far. I don't like it to make no sense. I do like it to be unknowable.
Yeah, in the sense that it looks like the old ones are playing 4D chess because they are. They're playing with parameters that are not easy, if even possible, to comprehend. Of that, some things you look and you go, well, that doesn't make sense. Like, they shouldn't have done that because that's just going to get them killed, or like this doesn't play into, it seems like, the angle they're going, because what they're doing, I think if it ever gets to the point where you can go, oh, well, yeah, no, it's really easy to understand that they did XYZ and they did XYZ because of ABC, and like there's a storyline you can follow here, that they kind of cease to be the old ones at that point.
Agreed completely. And that's why I think when I say just to vaguely suggest, without necessarily pinning anything down, that things like the 4th and 5th generation of Slann are all part of the plan. The elves weren't a mistake that didn't quite match up to what they wanted. The dwarves weren't either. They all formed part of the plan. They were all of these commentaries as to whether one species was good or another species is good is nothing more than mortal folk attempting to understand something they can't. And what they can't understand is that the old ones are not beneficial. They are not great civilizers. They are not the ones that brought all the technology from their empire for the good of this world. They are a sci-fi crazy space race that fucked with this planet completely and turned it into a world of, from almost the point when they arrive, eternal warfare and bloodshed and horror, which creates in turn a variety of terrible gods, many of which are terrible because they're fighting against that bloodshed. They have to be terrible to survive. And we end up reaching slowly but surely towards the very event we're here to discuss. I think we should probably dive into some super chats.
I was just about to say. We were here. Father Ever Chosen, happy to see Andy back with us. Maybe next time you can be visited by a different Chaos God. Malal will come back.
Malal's a complicated deity.
The god of legal limbo.
Yeah.
Was the God War before the Cataclysm? I personally, I'm just going to say this very briefly, and then we'll keep going with the super chats. But the Cataclysm is a bit of a mess because what most of y'all know as the Cataclysm is only about like the last 30 to 70 years of a war that lasted for 1,100 years.
Yeah. Like, so, my answer to this one is there is no answer definitively. We'll go into it, and we'll provide you with a couple of potential answers because there is more than one. But we do have some very clear descriptions of what it was like in Ulthuan before, and it wasn't war. So my general suggestion would be, at least on a first blush, probably not.
CB4N, everyone knows the Cataclysm was caused by young but criminal forgetting to change the oil in the polar gates. But how often should I change the oil in my car? I believe it's every 6 months. But I mean, it would be amusing to know that there was like one Slann who woke up one day and was like, oh shit, I was supposed to like do this thing, and all of a sudden one of the polar gates just goes off. Bishop of Cheddar, why does Khorne seemingly hate Slaanesh more than Tzeentch? Especially if Khorne's the least chaotic of the Chaos Gods, while Tzeentch is the most. Go watch our Khorne stream. That's the easiest way I can answer that. We actually talked a hefty bit about the Khorne Slaanesh relationship. So I would say go watch that. Yeah. Jaguar Philosopher, how much about the Cataclysm and the world as a whole do the most educated ancient elven lore masters know? What do they not know? That's a doozy of a question.
Yeah, that is a doozy. So the most ancient elven lore masters will know a chunk, and they'll know bits, but you've got to realize that they're going to be seeing it through their own paradigm, their own belief structures, their own way of viewing the world. And the elves have a very, very elf-centric view of what the world is, meaning that they generally put themselves front and center of most of the primary tales. And rightly so in some cases, and not rightly so in others. So I would suggest that if you're doing it for your own game, as much as makes sense for the story of that game, because that's kind of cool. And sometimes if you're playing a game, it is cool to get some of these juicy ancient facts into the game, because everybody likes to go, oh, that was cool, I learned a thing. But there's no point in having all of these great, cool stories unless they get told by someone. I mean, that's the whole point, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I would generally suggest that if you look at the lore as a whole, try to ensure that you separate what the lizardman view would be from, say, the elven view and, say, the dwarf view, and try to make sure that they each hold their own important set of stories within their individual realms. But I'd say just mix it up with very, very subjective views as to how it is, rather than objective views and understanding.
Yeah, that'd be the big one. One of the biggest crimes in Warhammer is that because it's a battle game, a lot of the times everything's kind of told from a God view perspective. Though hilariously, it's still opinion based from a God viewer perspective, because the narrators are not very reliable. Whereas you want to have it in a subjective viewpoint, so you might have to make like slight alterations and stuff. Magladroth, I wonder if there's a reason the Chaos Gods went rogue and the War in Heaven happened. Perhaps they were corrupt or influenced by something no one knows about, like a Morgoth-like character or something they know something no one else does. We're about to hammer on that in just a minute.
Yeah, we're going to jump on that one pretty hard. There's actually some hints in the text as to what happened, and then it just becomes pure extrapolation. So it then comes down to the individual stories that you want to tell with that, or a later writer picking up with it and either running with what's already there or contradicting and making something new.
Yeah, space and time empire, huh? So the old ones did not only thought the world's important, but also this time is important.
Correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely. And the old ones will be the old ones, pretty much no matter what game you are, no matter where you are in the Warhammer world. Warhammer Worlds, the Warhammer games, they're out there doing their thing in one shape or another. And you could argue that the old ones of 40k are basically the same entities too, although that would be an argument that many would vociferously have.
It would be a hard argument, I would say.
Yeah, particularly given just how much the old ones have been adapted and modified through the course of the editions of Warhammer.
Yep. Jeremiah, just listen to the Spider God stream. Andy, thank you for using our pronunciation of
Appalachia.
There you go. As a Scottish person, I think you'd have a very interesting perspective if you ever want to visit.
Yeah, interestingly, we were just as a very brief aside, we were speaking to author Jendia Gammon, and she's written a bunch of short stories about Appalachia, and she was discussing the various things that they had as folk tales, and a lot of them really chimed with Lindsay and I as being quite Scottish. They had many like, that's quite similar. We're going to be speaking with her again, and her husband Gareth, who's a best-selling author as well, about building anthology books. It'll be super fun over in the Rookery.
Yeah, I mean, if there's a place in America you want to go where you literally can feel like you're stepping into a different world, that is one of those places.
Yeah, lovely.
Love God. Wish we knew more about the Moon People. Us too, but to be fair, like technically in real world terms, they're only like a handful of years old. They're not that old. So, give it time. Singemeister, what is the overlap of 40k and Fantasy Roleplay remain? It's messy, super messy. The big thing I would say, I would agree with Andy earlier, that you probably would see a lot more overlap between the old Slun and the 40k old ones than you would the Fantasy old ones and the 40k old ones.
Yeah, 40k has now gone in its own direction, obviously. Warhammer has gone in its own direction as well. They have diverged. To begin with, they had the same roots. And right at the very beginning of the show, they are the roots right in here. Also, the other book, which I didn't bring out, and I feel rather foolish for not having done so. But they are written in there, and they were basically the Slan. the old Slan, the frog people that spread across the universe, and they had a great empire before everybody else. And that combined route was taken in 40k and Warhammer, and then moved in different directions. So they no longer match the way that they used to. But there are still, for those who want to find them, several similarities. And not only are there several similarities, there are more than enough bridges there that if they ever chose to bring them back together again, it wouldn't be a hard job.
Yeah, no. It's just more like the 40k old ones really haven't, they're not the focus of the setting by any means, and they haven't really been iterated on. Whereas in fantasy, the old ones came up every single time a new Lizardman book came out.
Every time.
They got a little more detailed every single time.
And the same with the Chaos books as well, because whenever one of the Chaos books comes out, they always had a section at the beginning saying the old ones were there first, then Chaos came along and kicked their ass.
Yeah, so it's just the old ones are just a lot more relevant, frankly, to fantasy than they are to 40k. Because for 40k, it's like they only really matter for like the Necrons and the Eldar, and that's it. Who are, frankly, not the main characters of that setting by any stretch of the imagination. Jonathan Scott, it was the best of times, it was the end of times. Yeah. T-Blob, geomantic web is linked with the moon. Don't tell me the geomantic's not linked to the geological forces, but geometrical forces. Should have listened to my math teacher more. Honestly, yes.
All of the above, probably.
All of the above,
yeah. The geomantic web is just a neat way of saying that across the Warhammer world, there is an enormous number of, let's call them sacred sites, because they are tied to the temple cities in particular.
Yeah, the geomantic nexus points. Yeah.
Okay, indeed. Yeah, nexus points, that'll do. That's in fact perfect. And they're spread across the Warhammer world. They're not just in the cities, they're everywhere. There's a whole host of special locations dotted across it. But they are just focal points for gathering all of the magic together that is this great source of magical energy. And in no way is it definitely only on that planet. The very fact that the old ones realigned all of the planets, every single last one in the system, so that they all work to a similar heartbeat. They all move at a similar rate. Each one of the planets can complete an orbit within a fraction or a multiplication of every other planet. And they will always eventually all line up again every so many thousand years. It's just how it works. The amount of magic that is probably thrumming through all of them is significant. And the focal point is on the Warhammer world, the fated place.
Yeah, but I would laugh in anyone's face if they were like, "Oh yeah, there's definitely nothing on the moon." Like, no, there's probably a World Shaper engine on the moon at least.
If a writer came along and said it's only on the Warhammer world, it really does make you feel that they just either A, haven't read it all and gone, wait a minute, clearly it isn't, or B, just didn't think about it.
Yeah. In some ways, the original Cataclysm was the old one showing up, messing up shit for the Dragons, Dragon Oaks, Vermeer, Drachenfels, and everyone else. Yeah, essentially.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, history's written by the victor, literal type situation.
Pick on those specifically. The dragons go to war with the old ones. The dragon ogres go to war with the old ones. The Fimmer goes to war with the old ones. And Drachenfels literally sees them arriving. He looks up and sees their silver ships flooding across the sky. So all of the above, yes.
Yep. Well, yeah, it's Fishman. Yeah. Hey, you read the Gotrek Field series, the sleeper, like that ancient insectoid race, they got their asses kicked by the old ones. Yeah, bad time. Singemeister, the Famir perhaps being one of the first races to let chaos quote unquote in is a very juicy tidbit. Also, could their reproductive issues be linked to their chaos pact? I mean, the Famir lore, that the updated Famir lore talks a lot about how the Famir swelled with power with the old one or chaos, but that their deal was particularly bad. So that when the chaos started getting in with like humanity and stuff, they abandoned the Famir, and the Famir fell hard because they were no longer being gifted and empowered by the chaos gods. But the reproductive stuff is more of a dragon ogre story. That storyline's been pretty much abandoned with the Famir, where the Famir have a much more normal reproductive cycle now with the matriarchs.
Yep.
Armand, thank you for the super chat.
Appreciated.
Dimitar, thank you for the super chat. Guys, I'm sorry I can't wait for the Manfred stream, so I have to ask you something about his origins. Was he called Boyfriend when he was young? He
absolutely was. I can confirm that.
Yeah, he was Boyfriend, and then he
Boyfriend. I love that one, Dimitar.
Yeah, Teen Fred, and then he was Manfred. Yeah, it was
Teen Fred.
It was an evolution. Yeah.
Adolescent Fred was the worst, though.
Oh man, like, okay, you can't turn him into a vampire now. He'll be like this forever. You gotta wait. You gotta wait.
Vashinash, I hate you.
Agni Zebra, have either of you read Revelation Space? Mass Effect took the story. The wolves are greatly characterized as truly alien intelligence skulls. I can't say I have.
I haven't. No. I should go take a check.
Thank you, though. Tyrant, my theory is the old ones came to create the ogres and populate it beforehand with snacks for them to eat. There you go.
I think, Tyrant 25, that that is as good a reading as almost any other, because as we've said, this is a mythic era. And that's the sort of thing that, as ridiculous as obviously the commenting, you've dropped it as a joke.
I want to make an ogre philosopher who that's his.
That is something that I could see very much being the case for some in-setting beliefs from certain tribes of ogres, where they believe that the world was literally given to them to eat. And the old ones, should they ever become aware of such things, they just presume that they've just been gifted it from them or the maw itself or whatever else.
God, I love that
interpretation, because it fits, and it fits really well. So for all it was somewhat of a flippant comment, I think it's brilliant.
Just like some scholar gets captured by an ogre tribe and he just keeps telling them stories so they don't kill him, and they just make this weird like philosophical jumps. That's great. If the old ones don't make mistakes, how do you explain Gelt?
There is always an exception that proves the rule.
Set 45. The first codex for Necrons had a scenario where you had to kill off a Lizardman army while an Eldar force had to defend them. Oh yeah,
good times.
Yeah, there are a number of if you ever like are chatting with 40K fans or like watching 40K lore content and stuff, whenever they bring up the old ones, it's literally just the Slaanesh. Like you'll look at it and just be like, oh, that's just the Slaanesh, which I've always found amusing.
Alrighty, so I do believe that we've got through our lovely chats, and it's time for the world to go boom.
Yes, so, and which actually reminded me that, fun enough, this is the first Lorebeards episode where we're not, instead of covering a character or a topic or a place, we're covering a war, which is fun. Look forward to more of those in the future. So yeah, the Cataclysm goes off. We're going to leave the old ones behind, other than maybe just a very quick thing of nobody knows what happened to them. Either there's some in-universe, the three major theories that are posited by in-universe scholars are either they died, they were possessed, or they fucked off. They got cut off, or they abandoned the world. When the interesting thing about the polar gates in particular being the things that blow up, so the north and southern pole things, something happens, and they literally implode. So they suck in on themselves and blow up. And the resulting explosion, one of the things that's really interesting about the Warhammer Fantasy World that a lot of people, especially coming from like a 40K background, may not realize is in 40K, where you have like the Eye of Terror off in space where chaos is like everywhere, that's just the fantasy planet.
Yeah.
They're just perpetually and essentially an Eye of Terror.
Okay, so let's go with what happened, because we do know certain things for a fact, and they cause certain things to occur. Right, are you ready? Because we're about to hit the Cataclysm. This is the Great Catastrophe. As far as the Lizardmen are concerned, this is when it all goes absolutely freaking wrong. Way wrong, because they're living in paradise as far as they're concerned. Everything's going wonderful. The elves are living in paradise. The dwarves at this point are living with their ancestor gods, who are presumably in turn speaking to the old ones. The various realms that we will come to know, the various species, are all established and in place. And then, for whatever reason, and we are given multiple potential reasons for it, the Chaos Gates, as they are about to become to be known, collapse. Now, these great warp gates, which were taking ships from different parts of the old one's cosmic empire, are directly piercing into another realm. That's the Aether, the realm of chaos as it will come to be known. So this thing collapses in. And we know from the Lizardman side that they had been, let's say, troubled for quite a long time. They basically had engineers working on them all the time to keep them in a good place. So this is not a new development. It doesn't just go, bam, unexpected explosion. They were aware there was a problem, but not what was about to happen. When it all sucks in and creates a mighty rent in reality, where no longer is it a thick Stargate-like gate, we have effectively the Eye of Terror. Wakes up at both the north and the south pole of the world. Enormous, huge gate collapsing in itself. The gate itself doesn't just go in, it goes out as it also explodes. And the star metal and the various other components start tearing down across the world. So that's the first bit. The heart of the northern one collapses in itself and then gets thrown out as Morrslieb, the Chaos Moon. So we've got the engines of the first one getting thrown out. We have a gigantic chunk of warpstone, as we will come to know, is nothing more than solidified magic from the Aether side. So the realm of chaos, when all of its magic comes into the real world, if it's not broken into the winds of magic, crystallizes into this warpstone nastiness. Now, according to some sources, all the warpstone we'll ever know is created now and by both gates. The southern gate shatters and warpstone spreads across the southern pole. The north gate throws out its heart, and the Morrslieb, as it will come to be known, spits down warpstone. And everywhere this warpstone falls, the world changes as magic slams in, craters spread. Now, before we start getting caught up with the idea of a sky full of fire, jungles going up on fire, ice caps melting, everything going weird, to give you an idea of just how cataclysmic this is as an event, the eruption of both the poles knocks the world out of its orbit completely.
Yeah.
It's so explosive that the planet starts arcing out of where it should be. So horrendous is this. Now, obviously, we have a new gravitational pull as well with Morrslieb moving around the world, spitting down warpstone wherever it goes. At this point, across the world, we have a network, a geomantic network of magic that is pure and clean, and thousands of Slann who can hopefully do something about this. But they work according to the whims of the old ones, and the old ones vanish.
Yeah,
and
I do want to add.
I
do want to add one really interesting thing about the old ones, which is the last thing I frankly have to say about them before we leave them behind for the story. Which is that, so in two versions of the story, I want to say it's the old world version and the either 8th or 7th edition Lizardman version. One of the really cool notes they make that opens up a huge question mark that I think it's answerable is that the old ones are supposedly fighting a war in the ether. So like the old ones are fighting something. And one of the things that I love that they say that really leans into the old ones knew this was coming, and they were the ones that did it. Instead of it being, the Chaos Gods did it, being the old ones that did it, is that it says the old ones were fighting this war, and the old ones were winning. And the old ones that, from the Slaan's perspective, it tells the story of the old ones apparently get the upper hand, and they start winning, and then suddenly everything goes quiet as the old ones are, from the Slaan's perspective, about to claim victory, and everything goes quiet, and then the gates at the end of this war that's lasted for centuries or millennia blows up, which the Slann think it's that, the pressure from their war must have been so great that it detonates the gates, or that there was some horrible malfunction, or that the Chaos Gods did this Hail Mary. But it almost comes off more with the update of the old world story of, no, this was kind of intentional, of almost the old ones going, it's time. Like, we've held them off long enough so they don't do it prematurely, but it's time.
Yeah, this is also suggested, again, this is running from memory pure, and we all know my memory's dodgy as hell these days after all the COVID. But as I recall, I think it was the 6th edition Lizardman suggests also that the old ones were responsible for it. It's right back in the very initial version of it as well. The idea where they don't know what causes it. And the fact that Lizardman books even are willing to say the old ones might have been available, that might have been responsible, it's, I think, just fascinating. So the Lizardman... Right.
Yeah, because the 6th edition... Sorry, the 6th edition takes the idea that the old ones intentionally detonated it to save themselves. Like, they were like, fuck the fantasy world, blow it up so we can get out of here.
Yeah, totes. So they leave. They're gone. They're either dead, they've vanished, they fucked off, or if you go with another reading, they are literally entities that live outside of time. They're just in a different time now. They've done what they need to do here. They have moved on. There is no longer any need to be here because the plan is now kicking off. Now, don't think we have moved from a world where there was no war to a world where we have eternal war, because this is a world where still the lizardmen are still clearing out pockets of resistance. We have a very martial lizardman species. So to reinforce just how much this was clearly planned, the lizardmen are an enormous fighting force at this point, and a ruthless one at that. A truly savage force that is almost impossible to stop until chaos comes, because as these gates collapse and this other realm floods the world with magic, the chaos gods, as in the gods that want to see this world gone, they're just done with it. They flood all their energies into the world as well, and it goes to war. Demons literally pop up everywhere, but it's not just the demons we have to contend with, because everywhere where this warp stone lands down and demons begin to form, all the indigenous peoples that are there, whether they are the newly uplifted species or the remnants of the species before, they are changed, they are mutated. Many of the species that we come to know and love at later dates are created in this initial cataclysmic horror show, which doesn't just last the day. The sky is raining fire for months or possibly years or possibly more. And the demons start spreading out, and the poor old lizardmen are in a state of very brief shock. But these Slann, they are way beyond your average person in terms of intellect. The second it goes, even without any instruction, they immediately start to try and hold the gates in place because they're tearing open. Without the Slann, the world would have blown up. Let's keep it nice and simple. They would have gone. The whole world, boom. But the Slann, so extraordinarily powerful are they, draw upon all the geomantic web and effectively put a gigantic, huge patch over both gates in an attempt to try and stop them from completely rending reality in its entirety. And they don't quite manage it. They pretty much shrink it down to almost nothing in comparison to what it could have been, but it's still not enough. And when I say that this is damaging to the Slann, it is enormously so. They die in their thousands as the chaotic rage of magic slams through them, and the amount of magic they have to throw back in turn burns them out. But they do it. They close the gates as much as one possibly can without fully sealing them, but still they're way too big and way too wide as they flood the world with yet more perverting chaos magic. But beyond that, they also realign the planet and bring it back into its correct orbit, as well as Morsleib, as well as Mansley, bring it into a more, let's say, less chaotic route. All of that is put in place because Morsleib, almost certainly is going to fall. But it gets put into an orbit out there so that Morsleib can't collapse down. And indeed, this is going to become a theme with the Lizardmen, with good old Morsleib. It is one of their great, let's say, enemies that lies out there, one of the potential world-ending events that they try to hold off. And they are the great brain behind all of the original tech-savvy, extraordinarily high sci-fi world getting wiped out in a wonder. In the space of a few days, what was a sci-fi world gets turned into pure horror and fantasy. Basically, it turns massive Event Horizon, because it was, we all know Event Horizon is nothing more than a prequel to 40K. It turns into a gigantic realm of chaos. The entire world goes to almost instant war, and different parts of the world are more capable or less capable of dealing with this. Dwarves, which weren't living in the holds, almost entirely wiped out. The elves, living in a massive magical island, in many respects have natural defenses which provide them with a certain amount of protection, but remember, the big bit they never discuss, they have fucking gods, and the gods are there also. So it's not just the chaos gods. There's also other gods who are definitely on the world at this point. And then we have the Lizardmen, who are bluntly a fighting force who have been trained for this day for thousands of years. They have been fighting against the worst that you can possibly imagine. Enormous creatures that are multiple lengths the size of a football stadium. Think of these great things that the Saurus are trained and bred to kill. And now they're facing off against what is the demonic equivalent of these. And it is not a one-sided war, because the lizardmen aren't rubbish. The lizardmen that we will come to know later are not the lizardmen that we have today. These are high-tech, capable creatures who, in the initial parts of the war, don't just hold their own, completely hold every single one of their cities without fail, and will do for potentially centuries.
Yeah, one of the things that's really, really interesting, and this is my rant about the Cataclysm, is that Games Workshop for the longest time, I said this with love as I love the Warhammer Fantasy World, did a super fucking shit job with the Cataclysm of that it is a 1100-year war, but if you read about it, it feels like it takes place over about a century and it's over.
Yeah.
Because if you don't read the tiny lines that are hidden there, you'll read, oh, okay, the Lizardmen lost a bunch of cities in the first days of the Cataclysm, and then you go over and you read about Anarian, and you look at the timeline and go, oh, Anarian only became like the god version of Anarian like 80 years before the Cataclysm ended, so it must have been super short. And then you go, wait, what the fuck? No, this thing's gigantic. Like this is like one of the longest wars in the setting.
Yeah.
And a lot of it is we have no fucking idea what happened. I have theories, which I'm going to talk about because that's the point of Lore Beards and it's really fun.
Yay!
But for a pure, like, what does the written text say? We genuinely have no idea.
Yeah. So what we have now is approximately 1100 years worth of war. And we have blessed few facts from this time. And sometimes they're deeply contradictory, where you'll find, for example, one very clear description of this is the first city to fall, and then another description elsewhere, cities fell first day. And then you go elsewhere, none of them, this particular area was hurt at all. Then you go elsewhere, they were fighting from day one, large chunks of Ulthuan were lost. You'll find that each author will take their own spin in this. And I think the best way for us to imagine this entire period is it was turmoil and chaos. This is when the beastmen are first created. This is when most of the chaos creatures that we understand are first created. This is arguably when the very concept of a Khornate demon, a Slaanesh demon, a Tzeentch demon, or any of the other chaos gods that were potentially still alive at this point were created. This is an early era of pure horror. And the lizardmen are, without doubt, the only strong force throughout this, with an argument for elves, an argument for Khaine, an argument for other areas of the world that have yet to be detailed. There's arguments to be made for others, but the lizardmen are a massive fighting force throughout the course of this. And they are capable. They are not incapable by any stretch. The problem is that they're finite and they're mortal. And over the course of the centuries, they drop and they drop and they drop. And the great spells over their cities, the temple cities will eventually collapse.
So the old world, funny enough, once again, the old world, lore-wise, actually adds a lot of really fun details, is the first time that they actually start giving some dates for the Cataclysm. Of that, we know that the Siege of Itza, which ended about, I think, 30 years before the Cataclysm did, so like in 4450 before Sigmar, they say, oh, it lasted for 400 years. So we know that Itza was actually out and fighting until about 450 years before the end, and that's when they finally get pushed back to the city itself, which actually gives us something to work with. Of the lizardmen were doing pretty okay for about 500-ish years,
and before that, it's pretty fucking immense.
Yeah, so, but I would like to get crazy now. I want to get crazy. I want to throw out some fucking wild theories and listen to Andy go, no, but I want to do it. So
that's half the fun, isn't it? That's what we do this for.
So for me, like
when we go wild theory, why don't we catch a couple of the super chats, because there wasn't that many. Get those out the way to make sure that everyone's had their say. Good idea. Because I'm looking forward to the wild theory bits. I enjoy most.
Snotlings coming at you. How long can both of you last? It would depend on what is the rate of snotling per minute. Because if it's like one snotling per minute, then me and Andy can take shifts, and I think we'll be okay. But if it's like an infinite all at once, well, obviously we're dead in about a millisecond.
Yeah, totally. I don't know if you've ever played Warhammer Quest, but if you get enough snotlings, they turn from being absolutely rubbish to, because they've got the gang up rule, filling up all the spaces around you, hitting you in a 2+ and just fucking you over. So yeah, infinite snotlings, bad news.
Yeah, frankly, I wouldn't want to fight a snotling, just like I wouldn't want to fight a raccoon. Like, no, I don't. No, I'm soft and fat. No, I'm no. CP4N. If 40k old ones are slum, what's the deal with Criminal and 40k? Obviously, don't you know he's the emperor? Come on, man. Mr. Pig, so you mentioning how the explosion moved the world got me thinking, since on Earth, earthquakes affect the rotation. Would the Slaawn use them to correct small changes chaos would keep causing? Yes, in that the Slaawn do make earthquakes around the world because they're shifting things. The fall of the Dwarf Empire and the near destruction of Skaven Blight was caused by the Slaawn literally moving the continents, because they were like, oh, the planet got shifted a little bit. When chaos came in, we need to shift it back. So they do that from time to time, and it causes devastating consequences.
It's much rarer later, largely because there's so few of them in comparison to what there used to be back during the start of the Cataclysm, where there was literally tens of thousands of them. But they literally get wiped out by the horror show that is the collapse of the gates.
Yep. Anthony Riley, welcome back, y'all. Make my Sunday mornings a blast for I play D&D and get me ready to start Wolf Prep. Oh, nice. Very excited. Hope you have fun with it. Where's the quick video at? I will have a genuinely good news update, an exciting good news update, but I don't want to say it until I have it in my hands. So I'm just going to leave it at that. But as a sad new thing of that, about 3 weeks ago, the editor, his computer, it was bad. We had to pull some finances to get him replacement parts, because it just sometimes a PC just reaches the end of its life and you lose files.
Yeah, I know that.
So anyway, but we're doing what we can. But yeah, I will have some pretty exciting news soon. But I don't want to jinx anything.
So since that seems like it's the last one, before we dive into all our theories, let's just conclude with a quick couple of short sentences here. The Cataclysm lasts for like 1,000 years or so of absolute horror, bloodshed, and war. All of the Warhammer species that we know today and the various factions will be birthed out of this horrific war, some of which will come much later, some of which are literally crafted and fashioned by this. It is ended by, depending on your edition, the elves, then the elves and the dwarves, then the elves and the dwarves and the lizardmen, then everybody, everyone was responsible for the end. But ultimately, if you're going to whittle it down to its very basics, the lizardmen saved the beginning, the elves saved the end, and everybody else ensured that what the elves did worked. That's a nice way of summing it. The lizardmen, if it wasn't for them, there would be no freaking world. And on the other side, if it wasn't for the elves, chaos would almost certainly have eventually won. So there's a nice balance there between the two of them as to how it stands. And then after that war, the dwarves come out, the various human civilizations begin to spread as tribes of humanity spread across the world. But we have basically 1,000 years of horror and bloodshed as magic spreads across the world and allows demons to exist in the real world almost everywhere. The only other thing that I think is worth mentioning at this point is we know there's a lot of chaos gods. We also know that several of them probably maybe even die during this process. Depending upon seems relatively likely. We also know that at this point, Be'lakor, the first demon prince, becomes first demon prince. Possibly did beforehand, depending on which story you go with, but becomes the first demon prince and comes to rule where the Northern Gate is, and effectively becomes a material god because he's in the real world, stomping around up there, having himself a jolly old time.
A whole kingdom of demon princes, and he was
and all the demon princes up there, he was the god of. So it's really easy to think of Be'lakor as the often portrayed sad loser that he becomes later. But in his initial version, he's effectively the fifth chaos power up there, if you want to know his level of power.
There's actually kind of a funny thing of that Be'lakor was so busy winning that he didn't show up for the Vortex fight, and that's why Chaos loses.
Yeah.
It's because Be'lakor didn't show up. Which is hilarious.
And I definitely think that there's a big thing that probably should run there with the good old dwarves and what they end up doing. It feels like there should be a massive contest between the two of those at some point. Because that
that would be great. So the only other thing I want to add before we get into just really fun speculation stuff is that we do have just a small handful of hard dates from the old world which are helpful of that. So 5,600 years before the Empire is the Cataclysm starts. So that's when the polar gates blow up. Then 600 years later is when the dwarfs come out of their underground bunkers, essentially, and start expanding their empire, because the dwarfs are so hilarious that they expand their empire during the Cataclysm. And then... up
through the spine of the world and the World's Edge Mountains.
Yep. And then the elves, we start getting caught up with at about 4,500, because that's when Anarion goes through the flame and takes on Ashurin and starts kicking ass and taking bubblegum. And then in 4420 is when the vortex is created and the Cataclysm ends. So those are loose dates. So I have a crackpot theory that I really, really like.
You love crackpot theories? Go.
Yeah, which is that I believe that the War in Heaven 100% happened during the Cataclysm, where the gods get in a big old big old fight. Not that kind of fight, a violent kind of fight. And I believe that's what makes Ulthuan vulnerable, because I believe that Ulthuan was actually relatively safe during the first 600 years of the war. Of that, the Lizardmen were out doing a good job holding back the tides of demons, but the gods made it where the demons were either couldn't or were too scared to come to Ulthuan. Because one of the things...
I can support that.
I
can to a degree support that. Right, so we know that the gods go to war. We have the War in Heaven, as it's described in a couple of places, and we have details of parts of that war, and that war is ultimately against chaos. We also know that the gods on the Elven side form into two broad factions amongst others. I'm going to argue for more than two. Because we have on one side the Khaine, we have the Kaithari. I always get that bloody word wrong. I will one day land in a pronunciation I'm happy with. On the other side, I should just speak to Gav. I speak to him like literally every week.
I was like, just join the Americans and say Sithari, which is not correct, but we like it.
Gav made the word. I will literally ask Gav. Because it bugs me that I don't have a pronunciation that I'm happy on. So we've got those two. Let's add a third faction, the Chaos Gods. We've now got three factions. And then let's add the other faction we know that exists, which is the gods that don't want to fight. So that's the ones who are off to the side, because we are aware there are multiple gods.
I would like to propose one more faction.
Sure, go.
Which is the gods that were somehow supposedly there, but also don't exist yet. Like Sotek and Auric.
That's lovely too. Although they are presumably going to loosely fall into some of those factions somehow. If they're
I don't know where they are, but I'm just throwing them in the weird fifth category.
We know that they exist, and we know that they all have very different outcomes in terms of how they are going to fight. We know that they are all, except for the Chaos Gods, pretty much anti-chaos or just pure survival. We know the Khaine run by Azurin's divine rule. We know Azurin, that's the divine emperor, the king of the elven gods, if you will, the one that eventually manifests within Anarion and helps bring an end to the whole war completely. We know that he was walking on the world and all other gods were too. It's mentioned in a couple of places in the lore. And we know that at some point, Azurin dies. We also know at some point that he brings himself back to life at his pyramid when the pyramid is besieged by chaos and almost all the Khaine are dead. There's only a very small number of them left alive. And that he comes up and he pretty much kicks ass, chews gum, and kills all the Chaos Horde close to Ulthuan. Literally murders them all. And brings that particular point of the war to an end. So we have ourselves a couple of facts that we can drop in here. Our War of Heaven is almost certainly taking place during the Cataclysm. It's when the gods go to war and they have different ways of going to war. The Khaine follow Azurin. The other side, I don't want to say the name because I've said so many different ways of pronouncing it. The other side, they choose to ignore Azurin's law and just fucking go to town. For example, Hecate uses dark magic and gives the dark magic to the elves and says we can use the magic of them against them. Hecate is known for doing this. The other gods, those like Khaine and Anithrema and all the rest of them, they very much go against Azurin's rule, and they just go to fucking town, murdering any way they want. We also know at some point that Azurin says, all gods, hike it. Out. Go. Because we're going to destroy the world. And the gods no longer take place in the actual battlefield. So I'm going to throw out my own crazy theory. Because we've got a couple of facts there. I like your crazy theory, and I agree with it. And that is that Ulthuan was protected by the gods. And they washed up and were pushed back. And they washed up. And at some point, Azurin dies. And they form into two general camps on how to fight this war. One is to continue with Azurin's plan. The other one is, fuck that. We need to do whatever we can to kill the Chaos Gods. That seems fine. So the other crazy theory is the Chaos Gods are literally walking the Warhammer world at this point. Because why not? They are literally there.
Yeah.
They are literally there, and they are the demon gods at the helm of the various armies. And they are looking to bring down the entirety of it all until Azurin eventually returns and banishes all gods from the realms. And this is a very Warhammer reading, not a 40k reading. In 40k, there's pretty much nothing more powerful than the Chaos Gods, and they never manifest. But in Warhammer, they're not necessarily quite as all-powerful as they're often portrayed in the 40k side, where they have literally killed every other god.
I will note that actually is support. I know we don't like talking about it, but it is actually supported by the end times, where both Slaanesh and Khorne do briefly manifest in reality. Exactly. And the end times is not nearly as bad as the Cataclysm was, as far as like the amount of magic.
Much worse. And we know that in Ranadandra, which is, again, uplifted from 40k originally. If you don't know what that term is, that is where the Elven term for the end times. It's the final end times. The elves often refer to the end times, and it's just chaos trying to destroy the world. But Ranadandra is the last point when the world is going to end. And that's when all the gods go, fuck it, and return. Now, regardless of how well it was handled by the end times, the basic concept of that still sort of as a kernel slipped through. The Chaos Gods potentially manifested. The other gods manifested in a variety of often really bad ways, but they return. So I think that we have a relatively clear war of the gods at this point, which ends, the proper war of the gods ends when Azurin goes, it's over, and the Chaos Gods are ultimately thwarted from doing it themselves, which means they must now work through their demons only and their mortal agents, which is eventually what leads to Inarian being in almost exactly the same problem that Azurin was in.
I would like to yes and your theory. As all good comedians do, just add on to what the person before you said. Yeah, what I would like to add on to Andy's thing is one of my favorite aspects of the Elven lore that we got, especially in the later editions, is that the gods actually started getting a lot of attention and a lot of little stories. And a lot of them talk about the war between the Elven gods. And one thing that I think supports that very much is Assuring coming back, kicking the Chaos Gods out, sealing them beyond the portal. And then when he tells everyone to hike it, that's what leads to the situation where Khaine goes, no, I will not. And they fight. And that that fight is what inevitably leads Ulthuan vulnerable enough that Nakari comes down with the demonic invasions. And then we get the last, 2 centuries. Because, the elves, according to a lot of sources we have, it's weird reading it. Because you read of the Demons of Chaos book, I don't like the reading of it. Because it basically, has that the elves are just getting massacred by the demons for a couple of decades. And then Inarian just kind of shows up and starts winning. And you're like, couple of decades, 200 years, what the fuck? But I will say, I love the idea that you have this thing of that also allows for the Elven God stories to have happened and have all this fun stuff. It explains why Widowmaker is where Widowmaker is, or why Vol is crippled by this point, and how a lot of the Elven gods have already started to run off to take on mortal avatars. This also allows for some of the really fun stories showing how the Elven gods get weakened. A story I really like is the story of Elenil, the god of destruction, who's the big pappy god of the underworld gods. But he ends up killing the vast majority of his children. According to his tale, he had 1,000 kids. And then by the time the cataclysm is over, something like 1,000 kids. But by the time the cataclysm is over, there's only
he was tricked.
Yeah, tricked. But he only has like 8 left at the end. After him and like a Dioth getting a big fist fight, and Ladriel saves a Dioth, and a Dioth is still pissed about it all these years later. But like it adds like this fascinating, really fun story of legends that also allows leakage out into the rest of the world. Like, one of the things that's really difficult, this is a very big aside, but it ties into this theory. One of the really hard things about Nehekhara is trying to figure out what the hell the Nehekharan gods are based off of, because they seem to develop later. But one of the things the Nehekharans talk about in their primordial myths is that they witness godlike beings fighting legions of demons from like the ancient jungles. And when you look at that, you go, okay, so who are they seeing? Like, but this opens up the idea of, I always used to feel very strongly as, oh, well, they must have been seeing the old ones, because that's the only thing that makes any damn sense. But with this theory goes, no, they could have very easily been seeing the elven gods literally fighting hordes of demons and going, oh, damn. And they develop their own myths and stuff. And then as they venture out into the jungles, they start to encounter these animals, and they add animal totemic ideas to them, and they evolve their own gods based off of this. But it gives a road that makes sense. Like, it's a little bit of a curvy road, but it's a road I can follow, and I fucking love it.
Agreed completely. It's a road that takes all of the various species as they currently stand in the Warhammer world, and the various factions that form from them later, and looks at it and says, you know what? They are all linked. They're all part of the same big story. And that big story is ultimately the old ones arrived, fucked with everything, and then set off a time bomb and watched it blow up. And the entire reason for that was ultimately the creation of the Age of Sigmar setting, for want of a better way of describing it, which means that the Chaos Gods and their great anger and their attempt to destroy the world, for whichever reason you want to pin it down on, and there are more than one popped into the setting, that's part of the Old One's plan. The other gods rising up from the deeply emotional species that they've littered the world with, that's part of the Old One's plan. The arrival of everything from the Nehekharans to the Khaines to the way the dragons were taking control of humanity. The very fact that humanity, to its very core, gets seeded with chaos. Because as the world floods with warpstone, humanity, one of the species that's most adaptable, takes on this warpstone more than almost any other. The seed of chaos lies within them all, which is why there's more chaos worshippers from humanity than almost any other species. It's literally written in black and white in multiple books that humans get their great dynamic and extraordinary ability to expand and build, and it basically all comes from chaos. They were changed by chaos, and in some cases massively changed when you look at something like, say, the Beastmen. Okay, the Beastmen, which have their source in a variety of potential human tribes. Literally, everything that the Warhammer world is comprised of slowly but surely locks together like small jigsaw pieces. And if that's what you want, the pieces are there. Having said that, though, you'll almost certainly find that a later writer, particularly if they're, for example, picking up some of the old world bits, they'll write themselves an army list, and they will go, hey, we haven't actually discussed how, say, for example, this god came about, and they'll just make some stuff up, and it will contradict that as a potential setup. But that doesn't mean that we should discard those as methods for trying to understand how the whole world works together as one coherent piece, where the lizardmen are as much of the story as the elves, who are as much of the story as the dwarves, or the Khaines, or the Dark Elves, or whatever else you want to be looking at, because they're all building towards that ultimate and rather poorly expressed end times.
Yeah, but I think for me it's so critically important as well, because it's like the elves, I honestly feel that they got the worst short end of the stick when it comes to the Cataclysm, as funny as it sounds, because while they are the ones that end it, it's so frustrating to pick up. Literally, I've looked at every single book. Out of a 1100-year war, the elves only get anything in the last 200 years.
Yep.
So there are 900 years where they're
ruled by an Ever-Queen throughout the entirety of this, and have been since time immemorial. What's going on with that? Yeah. They've got gods with them. What's going on with that? Okay, Ulthuan is this great big magical island. Okay, how did the demons get in? What's going on with that? What's the stories? None of it's detailed. All we have is post-cataclysmic stories, really. And you might say, yeah, it's the last 20, 40, 50 years of whatever the Cataclysm, but it feels almost post-Cataclysm in that they set up the finish and bam, finish it. But there is just nothing there, and it is a huge chunk of time that really needs to be filled.
Yeah, it was literally the last edition of Warhammer Fantasy, 8th edition, was the first time where a writer went, oh, I should probably include something in there, and literally went, oh yeah, Anarian actually went and saw a lot of the world, and Kaldor Dragon Tamer was sailing around the world trying to figure out things about demons and stuff. And you go, oh, okay, so they were doing something. And that's when it's like, oh, that's when Kaldor ran into Grimnir. And then, like, the old world, once again, surprisingly doing a great job when it's dealing with the ancient history, once again added more to this.
That's super important for the big fight that's happening in the old world.
Yeah, I know. The old world's like, I don't really give a shit about what's happening in the setting I'm trying to sell you, but in the ancient times, shit was cool. but
I know, not complaining. Good
yeah,
stuff.
oh yeah, no, it's great. But it's such a fascinating thing of that the Elven gods are one of those things that it's, as someone that loves Warhammer Fantasy lore and studies it the way I do, have been so frustrating for me because they clearly exist and they're clearly important. But for how important they are, the lack of information is appalling.
Yeah, and the worst part for me as well is that there's just enough that you can clearly build a story. There is just enough there. We have our factions of the gods. That's there. We have that the gods went to war. That's there. We have that Azurin died and was reborn as a phoenix. As we all know, his holy phoenix animals. He was reborn at the shrine of Azurin. And from that point forward, that flame was always burning there. We know that happens. We've got some key facts, and that's enough to really loop a really cool story round. That story's never been told. And I think even more potentially upsetting is that inevitably, at some point, Games Workshop is going to look at that. And there's just this small part of me that goes, they're probably going to forget all those other bits. And they're just going to make up something new. And it's going to be, if anything, even more frustrating, while simultaneously great, because we got something new.
Whoever wrote the Cataclysm portions of the Old World book, if he does it, I think he'll do a great job. If he or she does it, they'll do a great job.
It'll probably be a they, because I imagine there was a small team responsible for that, because quite a few of the sections read differently.
Go watch our talk about that. So okay, so that's enough on that crackpot theory of that. I fully subscribe to that. That the elves, the reason they weren't in it for 900 years is because God stuff. They had God stuff going on.
They were in it. It's just that they were successfully defending.
Yeah, which I will say, I actually think that kind of supports a lot, because a lot of the stories talk about how the elves, compared to a lot of the races, were just, when the demons finally got there, the elves at the beginning were just getting massacred. Like, it was awful. They just didn't have the ability to defend themselves nearly as well because they had not been training for war.
Yeah.
And it would make so much sense of that if their gods had been protecting them all this time, and then, the whole the underworld gods and the heavenly gods start fighting each other. The gods are forced to leave. Those that stay have to take on mortal avatars and everything. The gods aren't there anymore to be able to actively defend them. So the elves are suddenly like being thrown into the deep end and have to adapt horrifically fast, which leads Anarian to do something really drastic of, the whole, quite literally, as far as he knew, committing suicide.
I'll conclude on this one with, I've written this for my version of the world already, because it's a core component of understanding what elves are. If you don't know this shit, you don't really understand your elves. So it's actually quite important to understand what happened at this point. So I've written a version of this for my own game. So for those of you who are following over on the LAWhammer side, you are going to find this going out. We've already recorded the initial part of what happened there, but it didn't work. We didn't like the recording. I might actually drop it up for the patrons over in LAWhammer just so they can see the thing that we did. It just didn't work. But we've written this, and it's all in support of the Elven Path stuff that we're building, because each of the gods have got their own little stories that ties into that. But this is entirely made up. It's exactly what I would have done if I was writing it, but nevertheless, I'm not writing it because I'm just writing it for my own fun now, because it's a laugh. So over on the LAWhammer side, you will find it eventually going up public for free. At the moment, it'll probably slowly drips and drab behind the all access side on Patreon, but it will go up for free because it's not designed as a I'm popping it up and it's meant to be paid for. No, it's not. I'm just popping up for everyone so they can see it. I can edit it, then turn it into one big document for free later. So it will be going up on the LAWhammer side. So if you don't subscribe to our Patreon, pop over there, not to give money, you can just subscribe for free. And then whenever something new comes out, you can go, okay, it's coming, and you'll get a little ping from your email to say it's coming if you're interested in a made-up version of it that's purely made up by me.
Yeah, but okay, so I'm gonna get caught up on super chats and stuff, and then I'm gonna hit on a couple of like just major moments throughout the Cataclysm War, just so we can have fun talking about them. And I also am gonna put Andy on the spot and force him to answer a question that doesn't have an answer. Just see what he says. Okay, so yada yada yada. We left off for here. Firestake, I so badly want to see Andy getting the Be'lakor curse cutscene in Total Warhammer 3. I do too. That's gonna be fun when he gets to see it.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, it's super funny. It's like my heart goes out to the person that did that cutscene. He had to communicate a really complicated thing in about 2 seconds, and the way he does it is so funny.
I'm just going to pull up this one. No, not that one. I've got 2 blogs up. I've got a very old blogger one, which is ancient, and I should put a post in it saying, "Don't go here." I might have already done that. Just so you know, Farseer. And then I've got one that's over on Patreon. So if you just search for LAWhammer over on Patreon, you'll find me. It's probably in the links. In fact, it is. If you're watching on YouTube just now, which you are,
yeah,
there's a link.
It's awesome, and we'll post those links in the chat so you can.
Lovely. So yeah, there's a link already down in the video description down there, so you can find it there.
Yep, Nightbringer, crazy theory. The fantasy world is a prison for the 4 chaos gods and must be destroyed in order for them to go elsewhere. That is a viable theory. Definite viable theory. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you go watch the LAWhammering, might even
especially the most recent episode where you're going, hurry. God, this last episode was insane.
Holy crap, it was a fun episode though.
Hi, fellas. In the previous stream, you said the creatures such as Thain dragons wouldn't like the vortex, so there'd be less magic than the pre-old ones. If I'm understanding correctly, level of magic of the world, scale of 1 to 10. Okay, so wait. Pre-old ones was more like a 4, calm with polar gates. 6 was controlled during the cataclysm. Oh no! Oh, during the cataclysm. Oh, pre-old ones was 4. Calm with the polar gates being a 6, and controlled, and then during the cataclysm is an insane 10, and then post vortex is 2 and wonky. Would you say that's vaguely accurate?
Okay, so going through each of those periods, you've got before the arrival of the old ones, we've got a world which clearly has its own natural magic lying within it to some degree. And that is fascinating because the vast majority of magic, as we understand it later, is handled purely from the etheric side of things. So we've got something special in this world anyway that brings the old ones to it. And I think that your guess as a number, sure, that sounds good. They then channel it and turn it into a vast network of magic that they're controlling with the gates. I drop it up to a 9. This place is massively magical, hugely so, in a way that surprises and is extraordinary. I might even go, without it, it's an 8, and then with it, it's a 10 even. In that this place is special and different. So try not to knock it back. Then it goes mental. And the big difference is that we end up with 2 distinct and discrete forms of magic. The geomantic web and all the magic that's flooding from the gates. And they are discrete. They're not the same. The geomantic web is being used by the Slann again and again to try and stop the horror that's coming in. But their nodes are collapsing as the nexus points are falling. And as the nexus points falling, it grows weaker and weaker. And the chaos is just ripping through everything and constantly threatening it. That magic out there is almost separate to the magic that's in here. And it's almost like you've got 2 10s rather than necessarily saying that you've got yourself, an 8 here and a whatever. And the geomantic website drops over time. And then the vortex is put in place, which sucks out all the chaos magic. The geomantic web is now a fraction of what it used to be. So you'll find that there's magic leaking everywhere, leaking from the gates, leaking from the
and the web's like bleeding. Yeah,
it's magic everywhere, but then it's getting sucked out by the vortex. So I think that your 2 is, for as far as the magical creatures are concerned, potentially a horrendous reality. And you can see why so many entities that want magic, like Malekith, looks at the vortex and sees it as something that's stymieing their capability, something that is really, really weakening them.
Which, to be fair, Malekith is correct. According to the end times of that, there was a way to do it proper, but it's really hard.
Yeah, totally.
And could also destroy everything. Another question. I get that Lord Krog's delivered to Itza was insanely powerful. What did happen during the Cataclysm? How did saving a city help the war overall? Personal theory, Lord Krog. Okay, so this one we can actually answer. So
go jump on one.
Yeah, so
I'll leave Sotek anything, Lizardman. He does love them.
Yeah, I'll answer this last one and then we'll get into it. So you're saying that the old one's solution to every problem was to have more kids with a plan that foolproof. What could possibly go wrong?
What could possibly go wrong? We all know that adolescent kids are just the best. Old one, Dad, I hate you.
Old ones went out for milk and never came home. Yeah, so a couple of various highlights, which I'll start with the Lizardmen. So with the Lizardmen, like Andy talked about earlier, the things that we know is that the Lizardmen, you're dealing with a global empire. They're all over the goddamn place. And this is why if you're exploring the Warhammer world, you'll find Lizardmen sites literally everywhere left over in the world. Though a lot of them got obliterated during the Cataclysm, and other cultures would later come and build on top of them. But so the Lizardmen, they lose a number of cities that seem to be further north or in other parts of the world in the initial days due to just the sheer amount of because like Andy said, a lot of the Slann died instantly getting the world kind of fixed. And the thing that's really crazy is that, like Andy said earlier, the polar gates, when they exploded, the Slann were able to repair them down to a crack. But that crack was still so big that you still had millions of demons just pouring out of them. And the Lizardmen Empire, though, was still a global force. Like we read about that there were millions of Saurus fighting on these continent-spanning wars against the demons. And initially, the Lizardmen were actually doing really well. The Slann were kind of unstoppable. But one of the things, and I love the description of it, is that the polar gates were like pulsing every once in a while. So every couple decades or so, there'd be a pulse as more and more of it is just gouting out into the world. And as more of this new form of magic was pouring into the world, the Slann started to have problems because as they were reaching deep for these crazy spells, they maybe mispronounce a word, or like the way they were creating the spell would have like a slight issue, or they would just lose control of the magic, and they were miscasting, which they had never done before.
Yeah, the miscasts. Yeah, good point.
And the Slann started dying because their own spells were like rebounding or spilling out of their control. But the demons, this stuff, they're made out of it. So the demons were growing more powerful as the Slann were growing more cautious and weaker. And like Andy said, the geomantic web was having holes punched into it as certain sites were being destroyed. So it was bleeding. It itself was growing weaker. So the Slann had to be more and more cautious about drawing upon it because it's not an infinite resource. It takes time to kind of like recharge itself. They can't just use it willy-nilly.
I'm going to vanish for about a minute.
Yeah, no problem.
And so carry on with this.
I shall. And so as we're dealing with the Lizardman Empire, the Lizardman Empire starts falling back more and more and more because the demons start to get the upper hand. And this takes hundreds of years. The Lizardmen don't actually fall back to their cities till roughly 500 years before the man, it's weird seeing me like take up the whole screen. I don't like it. But anyway, the Lizardmen for about half of the war are actually doing pretty well. Like they're doing a really good job. They're holding back the demons well enough that the dwarfs are able to like start expanding their empire. The elves, the gods are doing a really good job over there. If our theory were to be proven true, which I hope one day it is. But eventually the Lizardmen are forced back to the point where they retreat to all of their cities. So they retreat to all of the remaining cities in the Southlands, Lustria, and we know that there were some cities over in the Dragon Isles and Koresh. So we know like there's the lost city of the old ones in the jungles of Koresh, and there were Lizardmen in the Dragon Isles. But eventually, The demons, so this is about 500 to 600 years before the end of the war. The demons force them back, and the Slaanesh create big magical barriers around all of the cities that even then the demons still can't crack them. The Slaanesh are just really good at their job. And this is where he's back. Hello. This is where everybody's favorite twin-headed bird, Kairos Fateweaver, actually enters the narrative and becomes a really big deal character. Kairos is the one that actually brutally overwhelms the Slaanesh, because he figures out that instead of going through these magical barriers that the demons can't penetrate, he just opens a small little portal inside right behind the Slaanesh and just lets a bunch of flesh hounds of Khorne pour out of it. And they would overwhelm the Slaanesh's defenses, their guardians, kill the Slaanesh, and he uses that to destroy 3 temple cities in Lustria. And eventually, on the 4th city that he destroys using that feature, the Slaanesh there managed to send out a telepathic message to the rest of the Slaanesh saying, hey, this is what Kairos is doing. And the Slaanesh refortified their defenses. Another city falls to Nurgle because the Slaanesh there, the geomantic web was weakened enough that with the problem with the Lizardmen, and what ends up screwing them over, is that because they rely so heavily on the geomantic web, every time they suffer a defeat, it's a cascade. It weakens them everywhere else. So for every city that falls, that means all of the remaining cities are now far more likely to fall. This is why Itza ends up being such a big deal, because Itza's the first city. It was the first place on the geomantic web. So if Itza falls, the entire thing collapses. Like it's just fucked. So Lord Croak, the reason him saving Itza, which only happened 50 years before the end of the Cataclysm. So Lord Croak was holding out for 400 years. He had this big barrier up. And then in 4450, the demons finally managed to put enough pressure on him that he's like, all right. And he sends the portal out, or the barrier outwards, and he kills, I think it's like he kills 100,000 demons in that instant. And then they attack him, and he holds them off for a little longer, and he does his big spell, which kills, it scours portions of the continent. And but he dies. But to go along with that, there's another first generation Slaanesh who I believe his name is Shikaboltka, over in the Southlands, who does a very similar spell. He unleashes a ritual that purifies the continent of the Southlands of demons. And it allows the Lizardmen enough breathing room that they're able to get their defenses really, really solidified. But the demons were hell bent on the geomantic web for most of the war. Though, to look at some other theaters, just for funsies, we know that the elves eventually get exposed enough that Nakari is able to lead a full invasion, though we do have fun notes that Nakari was in the Lustrian War. He had a lot of experience in the Lustrian War. That's why it talks about when he initially arrives in Ulthuan, he is brutalizing the elves because he's been fighting the Lizardmen for centuries, and the elves were not at that level at the moment. But then Anarion does literally what most people at that time would have described as a stupid, idiotic, Hail Mary pass of should not have worked, but it does. And he brings a god into the world in his own flesh. And the first fight between him and Nakari is literally hilarious because there's an author that does a brilliant job of building up how terrifying Nakari is, how unstoppable he's been for centuries. He's killed Slaanesh, he's been at the destruction of temple cities, he's brutalized the elves, and Anarion one-shots him. Just cuts him in half in one hit, and Nakari's like, fuck. But inevitably, this leads to the demons completely turn their attention to Ulthuan because they sense Anarion. They sense that there is now a god on the world and everybody wants to eat him up. And the invasion of Ulthuan literally becomes the focal point of the war, which, to the Lizardmen's relief, actually takes a lot of pressure off of Lustria. But in another theater, just to kind of keep things moving as well, we know that the Celestial Dragon Emperor and all 9 of his children, in addition to his wife, are leading the humans of Grand Cathay and doing a pretty good job. But they're very, very material beings. You know,
it's not Grand Cathay yet.
Yeah, it's not Grand Cathay yet. It's just kind of a collection of human tribes led by a bunch of dragons.
Cathayans and dragons and such like. It's not quite Grand Cathay yet.
Yeah, we do know the early ogres were also fighting side by side with them. So, which was, to be fair, probably a pretty terrifying army that the demons were struggling with. But they were holding them off. But in the dwarfs, we know that the dwarfs had been expanding out for about 500 years. And then, just like with the elves, there's a moment where the demons, because the Lizardman Empire falls so heavily, the demons turn their attention, where Kugoth Plaguefather starts focusing on the dwarfs, and he destroys a whole bunch of different mountain holds. He wipes out a bunch of mines, and he finally comes down on Karasakarak, the Everpeak, in a bid, because he's finally tracked down like the ancestor gods and like this big final fight. And that story is great because Kugoth Plaguefather gets to Karasakarak. The outer gates are not defended, so he believes the dwarves have given in to despair and have fallen. And he pushes in. I think there's like, I don't remember, there's like 12 or 8 gates of Karak 8 Peaks or something. And as he starts pushing deeper and deeper in, the dwarves suddenly attack him very suddenly when he gets to like the 4th gate. And there was a post by Total War that I found interesting that actually added lore I had never read before, where Kugoth Plaguefather is apparently killed by a dwarf king of Everpeak. He's not the High King though; he's just a king, which actually kind of does make sense because in some stories the earliest High Kings might have been from, or there was not a High King yet, because there wouldn't be one until the ancestor gods left. But he gets killed by a king, and then the dwarfs set off a bunch of bombs. And it takes the part of the mountain that's over the gate that the demons are under and just drops it on them. So the dwarves are totally fine. It's just that part of the mountain just falls. And then at some point in there, Grimnir also runs off north and goes to kick ass and chew bubblegum.
Yes, he does. Kick ass and chew gum up in the north. Totally.
Yeah. And like Andy said, I think there could actually be a great story of Grimnir not... I've always wondered about like where it is he goes off to, of like, oh, does he just kind of wander into the realm of chaos and all this stuff? Like, we know where he ends up. If you know, that he does end up in a particular place. But I actually love the idea of that he goes into the Demon Prince empire, because there's all these kingdoms of demon princes all butted up against each other with Be'lakor at the top. And I think something that would make for a great story of explaining why wasn't Be'lakor at the vortex? Like, all of the gods were like, everybody get on this vortex thing. If they get this thing, we're fucked. Everybody stop them. Why didn't he show up? And I love the idea that Be'lakor would have been arrogant and prideful and so much more focused on saving his little kingdom from Grimnir that he refuses to answer the summons because he's too focused on his own shit. And then, of course, Tzeentch and the other gods punish him when he fails to show up and the vortex goes off.
It seems the perfect way of resolving it. I quite like that as a potential story route. Indeed, if you take a look at the overall stories of the Cataclysm, we have pretty much most of the major, let's say species at least, that we recognize today. But the humans, for example, they don't have any great factions that we're at least aware of at this early point that are worth discussing to any great degree. They are tribal folk, many of which have fallen to chaos. Many of which are fighting with chaos, many of which are mutated. But the dwarves are there, the elves are there, the lizardmen are there, obviously chaos is there, Khaine is there in its own way, other areas will be too. This is the point where you look at it and go, this is a pretty fucking horrendous but cool war. Wouldn't that make an interesting Total War 4?
Don't get our hopes up. Don't get our hopes
up.
No,
that would not be just lovely, because we've almost played out the end of the world story that we've got from the first 3 games, which is lovely. It'd be really lovely to take almost a new game where they could start from scratch, entirely different factions, and go right back, and it would allow Total War 3 to stand on its own legs, continuing on.
In a perfect world.
I think it's never going to happen, but it would be lovely.
I'm going to get caught up on some super stuff here. Theory: is the ogre's hatred of dragon ogres something instilled in them by the old ones? They're usually not very big on grudges. It's certainly possible. I will note that hatred. So the war between the ogres and the dragon ogres happens post Cataclysm. It actually happens post Great Maw. Of that, the Maw comes down. The ogres are forced to migrate, and then migrate into the lands of the dragon ogres and kick them out. But most versions of the story that we have is that the war was just that level of bitter that both races have hated each other ever since. However, if you go watch our Dragon Ogre stream, we talk about that. What is the relation? Is there a deeper relationship there? Me and Andy came up with, yeah, there probably is. And it's probably a really fucked up sci-fi story that makes you really sympathize with the Dragon Ogres.
Yeah, so I recommend go watch our Dragon Ogre stream because we do dive into this to some degree, Tyrant, and it's worth it, I think. The Dragon Ogres may appear like they don't have a great deal of lore because they don't, but much like the war in heaven with the gods, there might not be a lot of lore there, but there is just enough that you can extrapolate a lot, and I do mean an awful lot.
All right, let's see. Mr. Shapirak, the spoiler gate, the old one, Andy, is down. Oh, Andy's spoiler gate blew up. I'm so technical, hold the line. I guess the demonic hordes of chat. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I did manage. I had a question about the old one's wider empire. Like, what is known about it? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah, so the little details we have, you can sum up with very few bullet points. Number one, it is spread across, in most descriptions, the galaxy, but in some, the universe. Okay, so we're talking not just in the Milky Way. If you believed it was in the Milky Way, it would also be in Andromeda, and the next one, the next one, the next one. It's a truly huge empire.
Yeah, they were in-game Stellaris. Yeah.
yeah, pretty much. So we've got that to begin with. We've got that they can transport themselves between the stars instantaneously using their gates. We also know that they can move between the stars using their silver ships. Truly enormous technological marvels. We also know that the old ones themselves, regardless of what form they may or may not have taken, were loosely sorcerer scientists, as much as we can understand such terms, truly accepting that the magic side of things was just science and it was just a part of their process. We are told in multiple places that they themselves existed in places physically, in that they were capable to be visited by a variety of entities. But whether that was literally physically or whether they went into the aether to visit them, whether they were a creature of both sides, is really uncertain. We are also left with the idea that they are, if you believe certain sources, utterly unaware of some of the deeper movements in the aether. And this is the bit where it starts looking a bit dodge, in that when you look at everything that they supposedly are, the idea that the Chaos Gods gathered and various entities moved close to the Warhammer World and they were unaware of it is almost laughable. In the same way that it's almost laughable that the Greenskins just somehow stowed away on their ship without them knowing and arrived and weren't part of their plan, whether it was Kremlo or not. And we can't say much, but we can say that they are connected to the orcs and that the Greenskins are out there somewhere through the connection of the old ones. We can say that the lizard men were created probably by them, but that the Slan may be a larger component of their empire, because the Slan were probably imported rather than elevated per se.
Yeah, it's. I mean, there are some notes in the lore that one of the planets, the V planet, the green one, Vespera. I forget what it's called.
Vedra.
Yeah, Vedra. There are a lot of theories that Vedra has life. That it looks like there are continents and that there may be something going on in Vedra. But it's very scant, super scant.
Yeah, you probably find that if any writer ever went to Vedra, that very likely you'd have lizardmen there.
Oh yeah, probably greenskins, I would bet.
Yeah, greenskins and a variety of other things too. A whole other Warhammer world just waiting out there.
Tyrant Ogres have an incredible win-loss record against the Warriors of Chaos and lore. Is that because they're great at it or because they don't appear outside of their own codex very often? I'd say probably a little column A, a little column B, a lot of B. But I mean,
quite a lot of B. Right, Chaos are scary. We all know Chaos Warriors are actually scary, and they're scary to ogres as well. Ogres are quite effective, but they don't have the same skill at arms that the Chaos Warriors have. Chaos Warriors are horrendously capable. So yeah, I'd say that is more a reflection of where certain stories have been focused rather than necessarily an overall trend.
Yeah, I'd also say when you're dealing with the Warriors of Chaos, they tend to be drawn to invade like large civilizations, as opposed to the more like nomadic or more rural is not the right word, but like that kind of culture that the ogres have, where there's not as much to be gained from a War of Chaos perspective to invade the Ogre Kingdoms. Doesn't mean they don't. There are ones that do that. The Challenge Stone is very infamously a place where the Warriors of Chaos and the Ogre Kingdoms like to get in a punch-up all the time.
Totally.
Yeah,
I think in some respects, you just how scary freaking Warriors of Chaos are, that you can go toe-to-toe with a freaking ogre.
Yeah, and that's the really thing, is that the ogres, like, just physically, when you're just dealing with raw strength, should trump them, but the Warriors of Chaos can hold their own because they're just that scary. Watchdog, how physically and socially different would each of the species be at this point?
Okay, so physically, no. Physically, pretty much identical. There hasn't been enough time for evolution, but there has been enough time for change, in that the human species almost certainly undergoes a lot of change throughout the course of the Cataclysm, where to begin with, they were whatever proto-humans were. And whatever they were elevated to by the old ones, whatever the individual tribes that weren't elevated were left as. And then the Warpstone fell from the skies, and they changed. Many of them changed into utterly...
There's literally a quote that literally the entire planet gets coated in Warpstone dust, at minimum.
Yeah. And humans, they just changed completely. Where elves, no, they're exactly the same. Dwarves, pretty much exactly the same. Indeed, most of the core species, lizardmen, no major change there at all in the slightest. Slann are still incorruptible.
I actually didn't think about this till you just said that, of that very uniquely, humans are the species that very likely are almost more of a product of chaos than they are of the old ones, because they're so changeable, which is also by design. Like, that was supposedly, that's one of the things the old ones favored so much about them, was their adaptability.
I mean, let's be blunt. They were set up to become the primary antagonist. They were set up to be the primary antagonist of the world. They were making Archaon. Yeah, ultimately, the humans were there to make Archaon and bring about the end of the world.
Yeah, because greenskins, basically the same, because they change super easy, and it's not a big deal. Lizardmen are fairly resistant. Yep. Ogres and halflings, two of the last races created almost right around humanity, very chaos resistant.
Exactly. Very chaos resistant. So
whereas the humans were extremely vulnerable. Yeah, I agree with Andy. Yeah. It really feels like the humans were intended to change.
Yeah, great question there, Watchdog. And let's flip over onto the socially. Socially, again, depends on the species. Dwarves, almost identical. If anything, they're constantly harking back to this era and trying to emulate it. If we go over to the elves, the whole concept of the Elven Kingdoms, as they were at this point, are already in place, with the Everqueen over them all. In fact, you could almost argue that the shape of one ruler over multiple rulers over local areas is handed to them by the old ones, because the dwarves also follow exactly the same pattern, with their high king over the kings over all the holds. So you've got this idea that there's this idea of a structure being put in place socially already, presumably from the old ones, but it might not be. It could have just been independently developed. If we look over at the human empires, the only one that really exists at this point that we are aware of to any degree is probably Cathaeans plus whoever else they add to it. I think there was one reference to Nipponese, so maybe Nipponese as well. And then another couple here or there, and all of them will be very different. It's just going to be different.
Yeah, the Nanakarans are not recognizable at this point. Like
none of them exist,
but they're not what we would know.
But the lizardmen, if anything, they're far more organized, far more high tech, far more capable species than they will become. Far more magical as well, as ridiculous as that may sound. And that will degrade and degrade and degrade and degrade as each century passes.
Yeah, you can go watch our Sotek stream of that. The lizardmen do finally pivot, but it takes them thousands of years. They pivot in a very weird way.
It's a pretty cool way, and it's still
awesome. Way I love it. It's great.
Yeah, I love it too. It's great.
Yeah, actually, the lizardmen do change. It takes about 7,000 years, but they do eventually. Or no. It takes about 5,000 years, but they do eventually change.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating.
Super fascinating. Love it.
Biofoot, is there a time discussion what the Fishman Empire might have looked like during the Cataclysm? So a Fishman Empire, to put it very bluntly, I believe you could argue very strongly that it exists. I think it's kind of undeniable. Go watch our Fishman thing. But they would have been racked by both the old ones and the Cataclysm. I think me and Andy both very much agreed that they don't really come off as a chaos race or an old one race, because they have the benefit of hiding beneath the ocean. But that doesn't mean they're immune. They would have been able to hide away from a lot of problems, but like they were still deeply, deeply affected. I think the fishermen would have gone from, I mean, if you think about, we talked about, I think during that stream, how if you had a Pangea supercontinent, the fishermen would have dominated most of the planet. And then all of a sudden this continent gets broke up and moved around. That would have been a horrible cataclysm for them, because you have continents moving, earthquakes, tectonic plates shifting. The Fisherman Empire would have been obliterated. And then another cataclysm shows up that also literally shakes the planet, and there would have been tidal waves and all sorts of horrible things. The deep ocean would have been deeply affected. And all of a sudden there's this new form of magic, which is mutating all the sea life. And once again, that would have affected them deeply. The fishermen would, to be frank, they would fucking hate everybody. They would hate everybody and be very justified in doing so.
Yes, I think this is a perfect space that if you wanted to have fishermen that were more on the deep ones side. So they're more, scary, or at least one of the civilizations that are down there. They're more the we have survived because we made pacts side. You could certainly make some really fun tales here, and then balance that off with a completely different set of fishmen who were very different, who survived through a different era. I think one of the great holes that we have throughout the course of the Cataclysm is, how did folks survive this? Because on the face of it, most shouldn't have. Now, the Lizardmen, their story makes sense. The Elves, once you include the gods, their story makes sense. The Dwarves, as they stand, their story makes sense. The humanity story doesn't. The Halfling story hasn't even been told. The Ogre story, you kind of guess they might have been somehow wrapped up with dragons, and maybe that's what helped them. But really, there's a big gap here too. And then we're moving on to other species like the giants and the orcs and the goblins. I personally think that the orcs and goblins may have thrived in this.
There was the best punch-up going on ever in the Badlands.
Yeah, indeed. And throughout the course of this, the orcs and goblins almost certainly also were subject to change, allowing us to move from the 40k style of orc and goblins into the Warhammer.
What about the gnomes? What were the gnomes doing?
Indeed, the gnomes as well, and gnomes 100% exist out there in some fashion.
Ironically, great race. I hope to see more.
Indeed, and not just because I wrote the current version of them, but they were also a creation of the old ones, and they had 666 different clans that were created by the old ones for specific purposes. And they believe that they were created by their gods, which they believe are synonymous with the old ones, which is an interesting, slightly different spin in it too. So yeah, there's all sorts of other stories that are just not here. They're not touched because Games Workshop as a whole has focused on the current era, and that makes sense because that's the era that matters.
Supposedly.
But it does leave, particularly whenever you read one of, say, for example, the Demons of Chaos style army lists, where they're like, the world was full of demons. And then you read the Lizardmen, the world was full of demons. And then you read the little snapshots of what was humanity like? Tiny little tribal things. So they're all dead then? No, because we have humans later. How? And the answer appears to be possibly the root of why high elves, or elves in general, hate humans. They all fell.
Yeah, there's a lot of really.
Then the demons left, and they were left without their masters anymore, and new civilizations as the generations passed by, because humanity's generations are fast. Not as fast as Skaven, but still very fast. New civilizations have popped up. Their old gods have abandoned them. They move on to something else. It wouldn't surprise me if large chunks of humanity simply fell, which is why they are not liked by many of the other species.
Yeah, it's like there's, the argument of, oh, well, the Nehakarans were, in the jungles of the Southland, so they may have been protected by those lizardmen. The Cathayans were protected by the dragons.
Or they were maybe fighting them.
Yeah, but when you get into, especially the people that now make up the Empire in Bretonnia, all those tribes, like the Tutikans and the Umburgans, they came from like the Eastern Steppe.
Right. So I wrote the section. I can say it without any doubt. The Gospodars and the Tutigans were both tribes of the north, which means they were chaos tribes, both of whom resisted or left for their individual reasons, but they were basically tribes of chaos. So that shows to the core foundation point of the empire that tribes of chaos we're ultimately at the foundation point of what would one day make Sigmar's empire.
Yeah. Makes you think. Singemeister, Grimlock dates back to the Cataclysm, apparently, are all kind of stars biologically immortal. Also, could Lord Croak solo Horus in the Siege of Terra? I'll get to the second one in a second. So the first one, there's actually an interesting thing about Grimlock is a very interesting beast, because if you go back to
Grimlock, sorry.
Yeah, so the first time we get Grimlock is in 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy Lizardman book, where he's the beast of.
I hate that name.
I know. Whoever decided that all of the Transformers would be Lizardman mounts, because we've got Zwup, Grimlock, and Zlak, who are all Transformer characters. Anyway, so if you go back to 6th edition, when Grimlock was initially created, he's not immortal. He was the most recent in a whole family of Carnosaurs, where every time one of them would die of old age or in battle or whatever, Krokar would pick a new one. And Grimlock was simply the greatest he'd ever had. But 7th edition came around and said, no. Grimlock is the original mount of Krokar and has been kicking ass and taking names with him for 10,000 plus years, which is like, wow, that's an old fucking dinosaur.
I remember when I read that, I was like, oh, wow, you dialed that one to 11.
What I would heavily suggest is that there is a lot of notes in the Lizardmen about how the Lizardmen are not the Slann really, but like the Lizardmen. So the Skinxors, Croxors, all of them are creatures that were elevated up and like had certain traits accentuated and stuff, or were combined to create ideal creatures. And it stands to reason that a lot of the primordial dinosaurs that the Lizardmen use were likely altered by the old ones as well, which may well have led into some of them becoming functionally immortal. Or
I'm going to throw an or out here, because we sort of hinted at this in Tehenuin's one as well. When we did the Tehenuin stream, go check that one, because it's a really good one. And that's the idea that you've got to remember that the old ones created the spawning pools. All the spawning pools that are handled effectively by the Slann and everyone that tends them underneath are not your standard birthing chambers. They could just be creating clones. And that would allow spirits to re-inhabit, because of the very nature of the Warhammer world. That allows you to have big battles, have it die, and then have it come back again. In that Tehenuin himself does that. There are other routes that we have, because we have the sorcery science effectively that lies behind the Lizardman. So you could have basically both sides of that story. He could be both a relatively newborn and the original, and allow it to work in a variety of ways.
There'd have to be some bush. Yeah, it's a pretty big bush, because those dinosaurs, like the Lizardmen, usually have to steal their eggs, and they're hatched and they're more normal.
Yeah, indeed. But I reckon you could get a whole host of fun out of that.
Yeah, another or you could do is fine. Yeah, you could also pull a Gotrek type situation, where because Krokar has like the Hand of the Gods and the Spear of Flunksla, that Grimlock by proximity has his life extended, because there's these crazy old one artifacts around. There are a lot of ways you could do it. Also, could Lord Croak solo Horus the Siege of Terra? Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, there's an interesting disparity between the power levels in Warhammer and the power levels in 40k. And not to get lost in this, because this is entire streams worth of pointless discussion about 40k and Warhammer. But very loosely, Warhammer 40k is, as ridiculous as this is going to sound, much more grounded. Much more. Yeah. It's much less ridiculous and over the top. And again, that may sound ridiculous if you know your 40k lore. It's also much more spread out, in that in 40k, you've got like these individual spots of light across thousands of planets. In Warhammer, it's all on fucking one planet. And they're all there. And they're all
a big planet, to be fair.
All the time. It's proper mental. But yeah, the power levels in Warhammer are actually silly in places. I mean, Nagash is genuinely daft.
Croak literally, it was killing millions of demons per spell. That's a sentence. Millions of demons per spell. What?
And the Warhammer world at this point is populated by billions upon billions of demons. It's an enormous quantity. It's the sort of thing that in the 40k universe, they'd be like, what the fuck's going on down there?
Also, Horus dies.
They fire an exterminatus set of missiles down, and they just get absorbed. It's proper silly. So yeah, Warhammer's power levels are actually daft. Because these aren't individuals who are, we're getting kind of close to being a god or whatever. No, the gods wander their world, and Kroak is going toe to toe with them. It's a very, very different world.
Yeah, Kroak was more of a punch God in the face kind of person, not a. And then the guy died and decided no. Like, what more do you want? He literally died and was like, nah, I don't feel like
carry on. I don't need to have a big throne to sit on to keep me alive. I'll just keep going.
I'll just keep going. I don't care.
Yeah, so it is worth noting that Warhammer has a host of characters that makes 40k look relatively mild by comparison. Now 40k has its spikes.
We're gonna get so many angry comments.
It's quite a different setting. It'd be a little bit like saying, hey, across the 40k universe, you get so many alpha grade psychers, so many of those per so many million population or billion population or whatever, and the Warhammer World is just like, yeah, that's our basic battle magister. We just got hundreds of them, and they're like, well, you've got hundreds of alpha grades sitting on your one world. And they're like, yeah, that's just in the Empire.
We got hundreds in like a province.
It's proper silly in terms of how the numbers are handled in 40k, how the numbers are handled in Warhammer. Often because they're trying to give Warhammer its own unique setting position. So it's of equal worth to all of 40k. And because they've tried to make it equal worth to all of 40k, they've ended up in this bizarre place where Warhammer, this one tiny little world, is populated with the craziest of crazy you've ever seen.
Yeah, honestly, stupid, just a side thing. I'm kind of worried / excited for if the old world ever actually gets its butt moving, gets to the Great War, because everything in the old world is literally already bigger than it was in fantasy, and fantasy was fine. Like the original Lord Kroak story, he takes on like hundreds of thousands of demons. Whereas the old world story goes, nah, he was taking on millions at a time. Millions per spell. And you're like, okay.
I mean, and just that alone is such a power disparity in comparison to your standard 40k position. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. Anyway, Mr. Pig, I would suggest that for some of the races, they're now more resistant to mutation than the beginning. If since the less so would have died. That's an interesting theory.
So there's a certain level of survival of the fittest there, Mr. Pig, that I don't think is necessarily inconsistent with what we're left with. In that to have survived, you had to have been relatively resistant. If you weren't, you were now a beastman, or you were some horrible other creature, or parts of your DNA is morphed into that chimera over there. Who can exactly say you're now the source code for that particular Medusa that's raised out of wherever?
Congratulations, your new army book. Here you go.
Yeah, exactly. Just go have a look through the Monstrous Arcanum and figure out just how many of them might have human DNA in there, and they're the humans that failed. So I think to a degree you're probably right, but more resistant doesn't necessarily mean they're resistant. In that they are still the most susceptible to chaos. Just take a look at the Chaos Army list in general. Yeah, the Chaos Army list is all human, pretty much.
I would almost say less that they were resistant to mutation and more of that they mutated in a way that was beneficial to them. Without changing them too much.
And then when magic left the world, their kids just bred more.
Evolution got it paused when the magic left.
Yeah.
Searing Doom. I came in a silver ship. Searing Doom would make
you can stay away from me with your Searing Doom silver ship.
That's a great name for a silver ship, though. Searing Doom.
Searing Doom was just as a small aside. Back when I used to play Warhammer, frickin' all the time, it was one of my favorite spells because when I used to play it, I didn't play on your classic a 6x4 battlefield, 8x4 battlefield. I was often playing on like 20-foot by 10-foot battlefield.
Goddamn.
Proper huge ones with like 30,000 point armies or whatever each weekend. And Searing Doom was extraordinary because it was the only spell that moved up to 72 inches as a range. The only one back in Warhammer 4th edition that had a really long range, which meant it ruled on a big battlefield.
Yeah, in later editions, that spell was also goated because it was such a cheap spell that you could point at the most expensive unit on the table and go, I bet they've got good armor. And they go, fuck, yeah, they do. It just deletes them off the table.
Yeah, I did love it.
It was the great equalizer. Matthew, I just want to point out that for the great plan to get Age of Sigmar, you don't only need Archaon, but you also need Sigmar. Very true.
Yeah, 100%. And I should almost certainly have said that, but I was looking on the more nihilistic side. The entire plan as it lays out requires humanity, requires the elves. In fact, requires everything apparently except for Grand Cathay, which is bullshit. And indeed, anything that's east of the World's Edge Mountains, who cares?
I'm telling you now, it's literally a matter of time. That's all it is these days. It's a matter of time.
Bloody hope so.
Yeah, I don't know what realm Grand Cathay is going to pop in, but when they do, I will not be surprised at all. The slightest. All right, but I think if anyone has some comments for us here at the end, we're slow.
Are we almost at time already?
Yes, we're rapidly approaching time.
Okay.
I believe we've hit on every major beat that is explored. But once again, I cannot reiterate that of all, like, we've talked a lot about how there are a lot of places and timelines in the Warhammer world where it would be great to have more information. The Cataclysm leaves them all in the dust as far as we know so little, considering how important it was and considering how big of a time it was. And granted, GW may prefer it that way. It's kind of one of those like Age of Myth type situations where it's like, oh, it was so big and so crazy that we just can't describe it to you. Because if we do, then it's no longer that level of big and crazy.
Yeah. It's interesting as well because in many places, it's so big and it's so crazy, and they really do lay down on just enormous number of demons and just how bad the magic is. And the sky has literally burst into fire as parts of the gates are slamming down into the ground. Gods are walking the earth. Everything is literally terrible. And then somehow the dwarves are kicking along, having themselves a handy little time over in the World's Edge Mountains without much difficulty. And they scale up and down according to the individual writer. So I do think that there is a danger that if they do fill in all the details back then, it will be less interesting. But that doesn't mean that there shouldn't be any details. In particular for me, there is a gaping hole in terms of the background with the elves, who are actually central to so much of what's about to happen to conclude the Cataclysm, that to not understand how they move from being in this beautiful little playground of the gods to the complete breakdown of everything is just weird.
We have just enough time for me to ask my crackpot question. I was going to put Andy on the spot for, and I just remembered. So,
crackpot question.
Okay, Andy, I've got a question for you that Games Workshop, that we've kind of played around with this stream. And I think you have an answer for it, but I don't know if you want to share your answer, which is that based on everything we've talked about, we've talked about regarding the Cataclysm and the Chaos Gods and how it all works and the Elven Gods and how we were kind of building things. For folks at home, Andy, according to that theory, what the hell then are the 4 Chaos Gods? Like, what are they really?
All right, so there is a few potential answers to this. Number one, they are great, almost Chthonian entities that lie behind the Aether and have been there forever and will be there forever. And this world, when the old ones fucked up with it, they insidiously came up with their encroaching fingers and destroyed it. That's option one. And that is the general option that Games Workshop generally pretty much runs with. However, it's contradicted in so many places now in the lore, where the gods of the Warhammer world, where the Chaos Gods no longer have the same disparity in power, in that the gods are all kind of the same sort of stuff. And the Chaos Gods are different, not because they are different to the other gods, but because they do not directly influence the Warhammer world, which is weird. Because if they're so powerful, well, why can't they do what, say, Ladriel does? We know Ladriel walks around in the material plane. We even have bloody short stories with her kicking around doing the thing. We have all sorts of stuff with one elf god who's definitely wandering around. Other elven gods are known to be in the material plane. We know that the gods were banned at one point. This is things that have happened in the lore. We know Ulrich wanders around being Ulrich in the material plane. What the fuck isn't Khorne doing that? If it's so important to destroy this world, why isn't Khorne destroying the world at the forefront? Even if he's being positioned in this place of, I just sit on my throne and let everybody else do it until today I'm coming out. Why hasn't he ever come out? It's been thousands of freaking years. Get your freaking arse on. He hasn't done it. Tzeentch hasn't manifested. Slaanesh hasn't manifested. None of them have. But they are keenly interested in ruining this place. They have sent all of their most powerful minions, and they come in again and again and again. They empower Everchosen, desperately attempting to destroy the world. So we can answer it in a slightly different way as well. They might be different to the other gods. They are weird chthonic entities. They are something that lies beyond, quite different to the other gods. The gods are a local Warhammer phenomenon, and the 4 Chaos gods are different, but they're not, because it's stated repeatedly inside the more recent lore that they're just other gods that are attempting to do stuff. So we have to draw different conclusions, and the conclusions are difficult. Conclusion number 1 is they can't come to the Warhammer world. We have to say that because they can't. Until the very, very end, they don't. So they can't, which means that we've got a bunch of gods that are banned from coming to the Warhammer world. And it's really, really easy to answer if you want to build a story. You can make one up. Like, for example, Azurin comes down and says, you're banned. You lot never return. You lot, I trust. You lot try to destroy the world and you didn't. So you're just banned. Azurin does it. But that's something that almost lies contrary to the 40k expression of the great chaos powers that are attempting to destroy the world, because they are made pretty much all powerful. The idea that another god could somehow ban them from the material realm is insane. Nevertheless, that appears to be the obvious answer for where the Warhammer world sits, at least, because they're just gods, but they're gods that want to destroy the world instead of having favorite followers that they want to foster or whatever. And the destruction of the world, note, is not the destruction of reality and all stuff, because Age of Sigmar follows. That's all part of what the Chaos Gods wanted to occur. So the answer is not answered. The answer is, if you go with 40k, they are just the big thing that lies beyond that's trying to destroy the world because they can. Fair enough. The Warhammer world doesn't actually matter that much. It's actually relatively unimportant because they're just a universal group of entities that constantly destroys anything that it touches. Or alternatively, they're gods of the Warhammer world, which means that they follow and abide by a variety of rules that all the gods of the Warhammer world do, and ultimately they're the group that are going to win. So there are different answers that we can take, and that's only 2 I've chosen. I could easily have gone through another 3 or 4 different other answers as well, because the Chaos Gods are different to the other gods. That we can say certainly. And how that difference manifests is something we could probably spend an entire stream just discussing out in a variety of different branches from a single trunk of why are they different. And we could come out in different places according to the answers we choose. But I would say that the lore is relatively clear nowadays that the all-encompassing nature of the Chaos Gods that they have over in 40k no longer is the case in Warhammer. The other gods, particularly when you look at the end times, makes it very clear they are real, they exist, they're extraordinarily powerful, but for reasons they choose not to interact with the world, unlike the Chaos Gods, who seem like they actually can't.
Yeah, well, great answer. I like that very, very much of A, that's really fun to think about, and B, kind of, you mentioned a little bit of Age of Sigmar and that, and it's interesting to see how the Chaos Gods have evolved in Age of Sigmar, where it's like in fantasy, a lot of the time they kind of give off this feeling of, oh, they're these big, unknowable, bizarre entities that are kind of don't really make a lot of sense, and they're kind of, whereas Age of Sigmar has kind of taken them and says, no, okay, they have character, but they're also vulnerable. Like in Age of Sigmar, they can be hurt. There are, and which is kind of, that's the whole point of Age of Sigmar, is that the Dark Gods are potentially vulnerable in that universe, which leads into the whole thing of, well, maybe that's the point. But in fantasy, especially as we've gotten more lore, going with like the old world and how Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition had expanded it, I actually like the Dark Gods a lot more now, because it feels like there's actual stories to them. There's a history to them that isn't just, oh, well, they're these weird, unknowable Cthulhu gods. It's that, no, some of them have wounds. Some of them have seeming like go watch our corn stream. Some of them seem to have
watch the corn stream. Oh yeah.
Some of them have vendettas and personal like things, and they're very like they're still bizarre entities and they're still kind of insane, but there's a story to them. There's a history there. There's something to explore and theorize about, which I just find so much more entertaining than like, yeah, you know, we can still have our fun little Cthulhu gods from time to time, but I much prefer what Chaos has become than what I feel like they were back in like the 90s and the 80s.
Yeah, there is I would we've discussed this before in other streams. There are a number of writers who, for one reason or another, are pretty much convinced that there is only Chaos gods. And that's where they write from. The other gods don't exist. They're basically the Chaos gods in disguise, whispering and lying and twisting things. And the whole thing is just chaotic. And those 4 Chaos gods are the lot. I think that regardless of that particular preference, the lore so deeply contradicts it now. So deeply. In so many places. Not just giving character to the other gods. Not just because Age of Sigmar clearly has other freaking gods. There are multiple different gods all over the place. Not just because of that, but because of the very nature of how the gods work in Warhammer these days in comparison to how they did. The very nature of the artifacts that you find, the nature of how the elves exist at all. It breaks down the more Cthulhu aspect of what they once were and turns them into a set of gods that are seeking to destroy the world. And you get those arguments of, well, why would they want to do that? To get rid of their worshippers and all that? No, that's altogether very 3-dimensional thinking in a what's not even 4, but more like 8-dimensional space. It's much more complicated than that. You're really thinking about time as if it's a single entity. They just want to revel in the eternity of what they are because they already exist. They don't need any of their worshippers, for want of a word at all anymore, because they exist. It's a deep and complicated situation that I feel that is made better by making them gods who are at war with other gods. It makes the Warhammer world more interesting and discreet and different to 40k, and it also makes it marry well with what becomes the case in Age of Sigmar.
Yeah, I wanted to bring this super chat from earlier back up of this leaning into that. Is there a reason? No, we touched on it, but we were like, we'd swing back around to it, which we are now doing. Right, is there a reason the Chaos Gods went rogue and the War in Heaven goes down? Which, granted, for those watching, War in Heaven can be a really confusing term because some authors are like, oh, it's when the Elven Gods fight each other, and other gods are like, no, it's when the gods fight the Chaos Gods. It's kind of both. But perhaps they were corrupted or influenced by something no one knows about, like Morgoth. So one of the things that is kind of kicked around that is a potential answer, I wouldn't say this is the answer, but it's a potential answer, is that in the Warhammer world, there is a strong theory. Now, I want to say this with caveats of this is from in-universe people, so this is not like God voice. This is the truth. This is what some people in the Warhammer world believe, but I like it, is that the gods are not able to resist being influenced by mortals. Whereas people worship them and people make offerings to them and all the stuff, that there's a feedback loop that can happen where the gods can become sort of twisted or evolve in ways, not all of them, because there are gods that just don't do this. But some of them do. And the Chaos Gods, like one of the things we've talked about that really makes chaos is that chaos is almost like this cancerous thing that takes a concept and drives it to such an extreme that no matter what it is, it becomes horrible, becomes deadly. And the Chaos Gods are 4 of the most worshipped entities in existence. And that seems to, the spheres of influence they have are huge. But there's a very strong possibility, which I kind of like the idea of. I don't know how Andy feels about it, but I'm just throwing this out there, that you could have the fun idea of the Chaos Gods before they were the Chaos Gods are entities that in their own way made contact with the materium or the physical world, and that feedback loop twisted them. And that maybe they weren't always evil. Maybe they weren't always these horrible things, but for some reason, when they made that connection, the very world they're looking to destroy turned them into destroyers instead of them having always been that.
I would be less inclined to give it a sort of metaphysical, empty source because it lacks story, it lacks motivation, it lacks interesting character. Because the Chaos Gods have story, have character, have personality. So what you really want to do, I would suggest, is rather than try to make sense of it, so to speak, is you tell the stories of the individual gods, much like when we were discussing Court, when we were going through the the hell that is that particular corner of the Realms of Chaos. And we were looking at some of the stories that could speak to why Khorne is the way Khorne is and what Khorne is looking to do. It's telling stories like that that ultimately make it much more interesting and deep as a setting. People don't really care about, why is Khaine the way is Khaine? What did Khaine do is much more interesting.
That's a good way to put it.
When Khaine is capturing Vol and tying Vol to his anvil, when Khaine is dueling Vol to defeat him, when Khaine has captured, say, Raya or Kurnos in an attempt to pull something else, all those stories, now they may be reflecting a real world, interaction is bouncing back, but ultimately it's the stories of the gods that I think would make it much more fascinating and interesting to deal with. The myths of those entities is just fun. And in many respects, it's a lot of what Age of Sigmar dials up on, where it takes the individual stories of these entities and it gives you almost the personal tales of these things vying with each other and capturing each other or stealing a bit of each other's power, or someone else trying to become a god by stealing that bit's god stuff, and that one doing that. And there's lots of stories being told. And Age of Sigmar is like the next step of what came before, or is it just the same shit? And I think that that's a good way of looking at potentially how to use the gods, is not try and reinvent the wheel, but instead take a look at what that wheel has become and dial it back and say, why did they become those things? And then that starts going, and why did they become that? And then you bounce it back and realize that the gods, as our anthropomorphization, I suppose, of mortals, are going to be reflecting many of their whims and extremes, particularly when it comes to elves. So there's a lot there that you could play with. And I think it would be more fun to tell all the cool god stories than it would be to say, and then God A sort of became created because it did this, and they talked over here, and this happened. Much more fun to dive into the dial it up to 11 crazy stories of why Khorne is fucking hating the real world, why Tzeentch must destroy it, multi-headed Tzeentch with all of his demons and all the rest of it, why Slaanesh desperately wishes to see it come to an end, and why all of them have gone beyond just simple emotional extremes to super extremes and pure corruption. They are the seeds that are pretty much eating like a cancer at the very edge of reality. What have they done that's different? And why did they go to these extremes? And why do they hate each other so much and hate the world so much? And that tells, I think, probably better stories than trying to metaphysically rationalize them.
Yeah, I like that a lot more. I think when it's dealing with the gods, especially, working backwards is a better experience than trying to find a starting point and working forwards.
Yeah, and you can end up with lots of cool stories. And again, because it's at the beginning and you're uncertain, it can be myth. And you can tell all the cool stories, lay some of it into the real world, leave the rest of it open to uncertainty. And that is, I think, a better way of dealing with Warhammer gods than dialing it down into certainty.
Also, if you try and pick a starting point working way forward, someone's always going to walk up and go, well, there's no time in the ether. And you go, shut up, sit down.
Exactly. And the old ones themselves are timeless entities. So, yeah.
Watchdog, possibly because the Dark Gods, if they win and destroy everything, the game is over. And so are they, and what gives them meaning. So this was, I want to talk about that for just a moment. That was actually a very strong prevailing theory that the end times and Age of Sigmar literally shoots in the back of the head, but in a good way. Because they actually did it in universe, which I enjoyed, where Archaon which we need to do a Lord Beards on at some point. But Archaon, his whole game plan in the end times was, okay, if I destroy the world and kill everything, then the gods will choke on it and everybody dies. Everybody dies. And then he realizes afterwards, oops, that's not true. Which is why in Age of Sigmar his plan is pivoted very, very heavily to, okay, I'll do it myself. I'll choke them myself. But that, interestingly, that was genuinely my belief. I remember back during like 7th and 8th edition when Warhammer, pre-end times, was that, if the world dies, chaos dies. So, the world won't never end because chaos will kill themselves. And then ends up not being the case. But especially
never really. I don't think the setting itself ever really said that, because the setting was always.
It was a very popular zeitgeist.
It was indeed, yeah. But if you looked at the general setting itself, chaos wants to destroy the world, and it doesn't matter if that means that in their insanity they destroy themselves. If that was the outcome, it's still what they want to do. So the idea that that's what gives them meaning, and the idea that they wouldn't do it because that would bring their war to an end. No, they would have won, or they would have finally got rid of, if you could imagine them like a clam, and they've got a bit of grit inside them, and the grit is that bit of reality in their aether, and a pearl builds up around it. They fucking hate it. They want it. Ping! Get rid of that fucking pearl. They don't want that inside them. So I think there is definitely a very clear sense, even from the very first examples of chaos, that no matter how much it might not make sense, you can just simply say the chaos gods are insane. They are beyond rationality. Even if it was to just simply destroy them, they wouldn't care. Khorne would just carve through his rage, impossible to stop.
Also, something all times are not. Time doesn't work the way it does. Phil, so this is the last one before we have to wrap up for today. Did the Sky Titans do anything at all during the Cataclysm? Do I think? Absolutely, yes. I would say it's undeniable they were up to something. Do we know?
Yeah, it's probably when the Sky Titans were destroyed in any realistic sense.
Yeah, it's like, considering that the Sky Titans were what we see of them with the Ogre Kingdoms, there's not a lot of them, which indicates that a lot of them probably died. But the few of them that are around, they're almost like demigods. Their technology is fucking bonkers. So they were probably rather nasty for the demons. But it seems like not a lot of them got away from it. So, but I would say they were definitely busy. They were up to something.
Yeah, loosely speaking, they were destroyed probably through the process of this era, and then mopped up afterwards. So, yes, they were and died.
Yeah, and I mean that's generally the case for a lot of those primordial species, is that if they didn't have somewhere to hide, they were either mutated, or they were so few of them left that they would either die then or died immediately afterwards.
Indeed. Plus, the Warhammer World's filled with places that are, and where did this city come from? An ancient civilization, and it's quite possible it came from another universe or another galaxy, and it slipped through one of the gates. Don't think the Warhammer World is in itself a single place. If you look at the Plane of Bone, where the good old Shrine of Khaine is, and that sword is blasted in, that could be a battlefield from another world for all we know, because there was gates all over the Warhammer World, all part and linked to the geomantic web. And when it collapsed big style. It's quite possible that the world didn't just gain its two big gates, magic everywhere. It's quite possible places from other worlds went into existence, bringing things like Malekith's Circlet of Iron, for example. There is lots of really, truly crazy tales you can tell using the Cataclysm, because the Cataclysm is literally an event that pulls together forces that contact not only pretty much every corner of the galaxy out there, but also most time as well. So you can get all the crazy shit that Warhammer used to be known for easily. If you want to have yourself 40k power fists or chain swords kicking around, it's not a problem. It's actually part of its existing setting. Just go take a look at half of the...
Just go to Albion.
Yeah, go to Albion. Albion's full of that sort of shit. And it makes sense. It doesn't just need to be tech of the old ones, as in the old ones made it. It can literally be stuff that got sucked through when the Cataclysm occurred, because it was part of a giant network of gates that went everywhere. So yeah, 40k is part of the Warhammer world, if you wish it to be. The Warhammer world itself is a truly crazy place that isn't just its 15,000 years worth of time, because it is connected to the entire network of the Old One's empire.
Yeah, especially because, I mean, the thing you always got to remember is that the Warhammer world is literally about 10% of it being like the top 5%, and the bottom 5% is perpetually in the realm of chaos. Like, the realm of chaos is right there. You can walk into it. It is always there at all times.
I'm just going to bring this one up because it amuses me. As an excuse to play my turn as an old one, my last Warhammer campaign, and it was a Warhammer campaign, ended with my PCs invading a Tyranid Hive fleet. Yeah, that was arriving at the Warhammer world.
Yeah, honestly, Tyranid showing up in Warhammer would be the least surprising, I feel like, 40k arrival. I'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Tyranids of Umbria. Wow, what a surprise.
It was Hive Fleet Triton, and the scenario was called Attack on Triton, and it was good fun.
Yeah. Anyway, that's our time. Dark Deeds. Make sure to, if you haven't picked up Dark Deeds.
It's almost released now. I'm going to have to give Modiphius a ping just to double check when the release date is.
Yes, I would.
The actual printed version. Actually, on Dark Deeds, just a nice little thing. We've got a bunch of blogs that Modiphius have posted up about the game. So I'll do a bunch of links over to those somewhere so that if you want to go on, you're not wrong, Hawk. Attack and Triton. If you want to go and read about the game and what it's about, have a look at some of the card art and all the rest of it. We've got a bunch of blogs that Modiphius have posted. I will pop up links for those somewhere before next week.
Awesome. And last thing, make sure again you join us for Wednesday, where you get to see Sotek's terribly made, but you're going to deal with it, PowerPoint presentation.
And we'll also discuss how the entire campaign should come to an end.
Yes, and it's gonna be fun. I've got art, I got maps, I've got little text things. It'll be fun. So yeah, we'll see y'all then, and that's at 6 p.m. CST, midnight BST on this channel. So the lobby for that will be up soon. Also, the vote for next week's Lorebeards will also be on this channel. Everything's happening on LAWhammer this week. We need to stream about Andy's wild campaign. I feel like Andy
no idea how wild it got in the end.
I feel like Andy could do that without me being here, just being like, oh,
what
everything he says.
Yeah, it was proper crazy, Jeremiah. Proper crazy. Because why not dial it up to 11? You're playing Warhammer.
That's the whole point. Have fun with it. All right, so we're out of here. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you again soon. Thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.